declaration.
Thank you. The next item of business is a statement by Nicola Sturgeon on the Independence White Paper. The Deputy First Minister will take questions at the end of her statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. I call on Nicola Sturgeon. Deputy First Minister, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. With your permission, I would like to make a statement on Scotland's future, the Scottish Government's comprehensive guide to an independent Scotland, which was published earlier today and made available to all members from 10 o'clock this morning. Scotland's future runs to 670 pages and 170,000 words. It is the most detailed prospectus for the independence of a country that has ever been published. The Government promised the people of Scotland, and indeed this Parliament, detailed proposals for independence, the opportunities of independence, the benefits for individuals, families, communities and our nation as a whole, and the practicalities of how we move from a yes vote in September next year to becoming an independent country in March 2016. Scotland's future provides all of this detail and more. I realise that members will need time to read and digest the contents of this landmark document. The Government has therefore made time for a full debate tomorrow afternoon, and I am sure that there will be many opportunities to discuss and debate the detail of it, both here in Parliament and across the country, in the months leading up to the referendum. Today, Presiding Officer, I want to set out the key themes of Scotland's future and provide information on how the Government intends to raise awareness of it and ensure that the public knows how to access the guide and the detailed information that it contains. As members will be aware, the guide is in 5 parts. Part 1 gives an overview of the compelling case for independence and describes what our newly independent Scotland will look like. Part 2 sets out the financial strengths of our country, forecasts Scotland's fiscal position at the point of independence and makes clear how this Government, if elected in 2016 to be the first government of an independent Scotland, would deliver our early priorities within sound public finances. Part 3 details the benefits and opportunities of independence across the entire range of government responsibilities that will transfer from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament in the event of a yes vote, and illustrates through a set of Scottish Government policy choices how we can start to use the new powers of independence to grow our economy and tackle the inequality that is so unacceptable in our rich country. Part 4 describes how we will become independent, the negotiations, agreements and preparations that will be required in the transition period between a yes vote next year and Independence Day on the 24th of March 2016. It also considers the opportunity that independence will give us to develop a modern, written constitution fit for the 21st century. And finally, Part 5 provides a comprehensive set of answers, 650 in all, to the range of questions that we have been asked about the benefits and practicalities of independence. Presiding Officer, I will now talk about the contents of each of these parts in more detail. The case for independence that is set out in Part 1 rests on 3 key pillars: democracy, prosperity and social justice. The Scottish Government wants Scotland to become an independent country because we believe that decisions about Scotland should be taken by the people who care most about the future of Scotland, those of us who live and work here. It is better and right that decisions are made here in our democratically elected Parliament and not by Westminster governments that are very often in government despite having lost the election in Scotland. That is the democratic case for independence. We want Scotland to become independent because we believe that access to our own vast resources and the ability to take decisions that will grow our economy faster are essential to put our economy and our public finances on a strong and sustainable footing and ensure that our country can reach its full potential. That is the economic case for independence. And we want Scotland to become independent because we believe that being part of one of the most unequal countries in the developed world is simply not acceptable, and that with independence we can choose to do things differently. We can ensure that our children get the best possible start in life and that we have public services to be proud of. We can ensure that the incomes of the lowest paid keep pace with the cost of living. And we can design a system of social protection that invests in the potential of people, one that supports people into work, but provides a decent safety net for those who can't. That, Presiding Officer, is the social justice case for independence. Part 1 of Scotland's Future also sets out some of the very real consequences for Scotland if there is a no vote in the referendum. The fact is, there will be no guarantee whatsoever of any more powers for our Parliament. There will be a real threat to Scotland's budget from the review of the Barnett formula that senior politicians in all UK parties now seem to favour, and there will be a real and present risk that Scotland could be taken out of the European Union against our will. These are the real consequences of voting no in the referendum next year. Part 2 of this document on our national finances demonstrates that we are a wealthy and productive country. With independence, we would be the 8th richest country in the OECD in terms of output per head of population and the 10th richest country in terms of income per head. We more than pay our way. For every one of the last 30 years, whether oil prices have been high or oil prices have been low, estimates show that we have generated more tax per head than the UK as a whole. Our financial foundations, Presiding Officer, are solid. Even with a population share of UK debt, our debt to GDP ratio is projected to be lower than the UK's. So our starting point is a strong one. But the starting point is just that, a starting point. The real benefit of independence is the ability it gives us to shape our own future. Beyond 2016, our future prosperity will depend on the decisions we make as a nation. And that is the whole point of independence. We will have the chance to make different and better decisions for Scotland. We will not simply continue with the same old Westminster policies that have failed us in the past and will fail us again in the future. Instead, we can take the action that is needed to grow our economy and ensure that we have a growing, healthy and skilled population. Part 3, Presiding Officer, sets out exactly how we can start to do this. It provides a comprehensive analysis of the benefits that independence will bring across the entire range of policy areas and sets out just some of the ways in which this government would use the new powers of independence. I will highlight here just a few. Firstly, with control of our own resources, we could embark on a transformational expansion of childcare. It is our aim that all children from age 1 to when they enter school will have access to a guaranteed 30 hours of childcare per week for 38 weeks of the year, the same number of hours as children spend at primary school. By the end of the first term, we intend to have delivered this policy for all 3- and 4-year-olds and vulnerable 2-year-olds. This policy will provide our children with the best start in life. It will enable many more women to join the workforce to fulfil their potential, provide for their families and contribute tax revenue to our economy. And, Presiding Officer, it will create 35,000 new jobs. Presiding Officer, independence allows us to ensure that the economic benefits from increased growth and therefore increased tax revenues will stay in Scotland rather than flow straight to the Westminster Treasury. Presiding Officer, that is why we need independence to successfully deliver this groundbreaking policy. Secondly, we would call a halt to the damaging Westminster policies that are pushing so many people into poverty. We would abolish the bedroom tax within a year of the first election to the first independent Parliament. And we would choose not to proceed with the rollout of universal credit and personal independence payments. These programmes are mired in controversy and delay, and they will cause misery to some of our most vulnerable citizens. Independence will give us the chance, informed by the ongoing work of our expert group on welfare, to build a fair and efficient social protection system that is fit for purpose. And thirdly, Presiding Officer, because we know that a fair society needs a strong economy, we will ensure that our business taxes are competitive and support growth. We will do this as part of an industrial and economic policy to grow our economy, boost jobs and increase participation in the workforce. This paper contains many other detailed proposals for an independent Scotland. the advantages for our farmers and fishing communities, for broadcasting, for our transport connections and for our universities. It sets out exactly how we will effect the transition from being a member of the EU as part of the UK to being a fully independent member with a seat at the top table and the ability to protect our vital national interests. It sets out how the governance of our nation would be underpinned by a written constitution to protect our freedom and our rights. It describes in detail the arrangements we will put in place to secure and defend our nation. And it sets out our clear aim that during the first parliamentary term of an independent Scotland, nuclear weapons of mass destruction will be removed from our country once and for all. Presiding Officer, these are just some of the benefits of Scotland becoming an independent country. And Part 4 sets out how we will make the transition from a yes vote in the referendum to becoming that independent country in March 2016. It describes the preparations and the legal processes that will be required and the range of negotiations that we will have with Westminster, the European Union and other international partners. These negotiations will include arrangements for the Sterling area, the equitable division of assets and liabilities, the seamless delivery of public services across Scotland and the rest of the UK, and our continued membership of the EU and other international organisations. On all of these, we set out reasonable, rational and common-sense proposals that are in the interests of Scotland and in the interests of the rest of the UK. And finally, Presiding Officer, Part 5 answers the range of questions that have been asked of us in recent months. This extensive and detailed Q&A, which is fully searchable online, will be a valuable resource for everyone in Scotland, indeed for everyone in this Scottish Parliament. Presiding Officer, this Guide to Independence is intended for the public. We want as many people as possible to read it. So let me turn now to what we will do to ensure that everyone in Scotland has the opportunity to read it. This guide has an initial print run of 20,000 copies, but it will be made available to everyone who requests a copy. It has been designed to be as accessible and reader-friendly as possible. A summary document is also available in print and online. A fully searchable document is available at www.scotreferendum.com, and reference copies will be available in local libraries. An e-book version is available on the Scot Referendum website and from the iTunes Store and Amazon. Anyone who wants a hard copy can request one by emailing referendum white paper at scotland.gsi.gov.uk, or they can phone 0300 012 1809. Copies for individuals in the UK will be free, while bulk and overseas orders will attract a charge of £10 plus postage and packaging. A public information campaign will be launched later this week using radio, press and outdoor advertising, and an information postcard will be sent to every household advising people how they can access the guide. The total cost of the public information campaign will be £450,000. A final figure for the printing of the document itself will not be available until we know what the final demand for hard copies turns out to be, but I will, of course, update Parliament further on that in due course. In the 1997 devolution referendum, alongside publication of the white paper, a leaflet was posted to every household and a promotional video was produced by the then Scottish Office. There is therefore a clear precedent for public information activity on the scale proposed. Presiding Officer, we face a historic year in Scotland. Two key dates are now firmly established: the 18th of September 2014, when we choose our future, and the 24th of March 2016, when we will, I believe, become an independent country. I believe that with its comprehensive set of answers about the practicalities of independence and its detailed proposals on the benefits of independence, Scotland's future will now be the document that drives this debate. It sets out the vision and the detailed plan. There is simply no equivalent on the no side. With Scotland's future providing the positive case for a yes vote, the absence of detail and vision from the no side will no longer be enough. Today's publication changes the dynamic of this debate. The challenge is now for those who oppose independence to move beyond Project Fear and give us their vision for Scotland's future and to answer the important questions about what happens to Scotland if we don't vote yes. Presiding Officer, our message to the people of Scotland is this. Take the opportunity to read Scotland's future. Consider the positive opportunities that independence offers our country. Compare and contrast it with the relentless negativity of the other side and make up your own mind. Presiding Officer, as of today, Scotland's future really is in Scotland's hands.
Thank you. Order. Order. Deputy First Minister will now take questions. I intend to allow 30 minutes for questions, after which we move on to the next item of business. It would be helpful if members wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak button now. Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, what we have today doesn't mark the beginning of the end of the United Kingdom, but perhaps it marks the beginning of the end of the Yes campaign. 670 pages, yes, but 670 pages of assertion and uncertainty, amplified by a statement from the Deputy First Minister, which was a full exercise in assertion without evidence. So still no guarantee on the currency. The much-vaunted legal opinion on our EU membership noticeable only by its absence. And the headline offer, another promise on childcare which the Scottish Government could deliver now, but refuses to do so. Children denied the chance of proper care until their parents vote the way the SNP want them to. How cynical is that? Now, beyond today's events, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Does the Deputy First Minister not accept that she cannot guarantee Scots what currency they would have for their wages, their mortgages, their pensions and their savings? That she cannot guarantee that because her plan is to rely on the goodwill of the rest of the United Kingdom, the same people,
Order.
It requires her to rely on the goodwill of the rest of the United Kingdom, the same people she claims are doing us down, and it's why we need to leave the United Kingdom in the first place. But of course, the Deputy First Minister says that if Scotland isn't allowed to keep the pound, we shall simply default on our debts. The reality is this. The SNP are asking for a divorce, but they want to keep the joint bank account. So, is Plan B simply to do a runner?
Deputy First Minister. Order. Order.
It's good to know that
Deputy First Minister.
It's good to know that on this important day for Scotland, Joanne Lamont is her usual cheery self. Certainly one thing that is certain, one thing that is absolutely certain in this referendum debate is that whenever she gets the opportunity, Joanne Lamont manages to strike entirely the wrong tone and note. It doesn't surprise me. It really doesn't surprise me to hear Joanne Lamont's questions. I could have written Joanne Lamont's script at any time over the past few weeks. There was an article in the Spectator magazine a couple of weeks ago saying that they had already seen the no side's rebuttal to the white paper before it was even published. So we know what the no side will say. It's hardly a surprise you're trying to persuade people to vote no. Let me take the two substantive issues that Joanne Lamont raised. On the European Union, we set out here a clear, reasonable and rational position fully consistent with our legal advice that shows how Scotland will make the transition to being a member of the EU as part of the UK, to being an independent member of the EU, able to properly represent our national interests. And you know something? The only risk that exists right now to Scotland's membership of the European Union is the in-out referendum offered by David Cameron that risks taking us out of the European Union against our will. And on currency, let me make it very clear to Joanne Lamont, in case she has missed it, Scotland will continue to use the pound, that pound that is much ours as it is the rest of the UK's. And that position is not just put forward as a reasonable and rational position in the interests of Scotland, it is put forward because it is a reasonable and rational position in the interests of the rest of the UK as well, for three reasons. Firstly, our trading relationship. Scotland is the rest of the UK's second biggest export market. They export 60 billion of goods into Scotland. It would make no sense for a Westminster government to force its own businesses into a different currency. And secondly, our massive contribution to the UK's balance of payments. If we take our 40 billion of oil and gas exports out of the UK's balance of payments, it leaves rather a big hole that would be extremely damaging to a sterling currency. And thirdly, the point that Joanne Lamont alluded to. I'm not making any threats. I'll leave that to the other side of this campaign. I'm simply making the point that in any sensible negotiation, we talk about assets and liabilities. I think Scotland should take a fair share of liabilities of the UK, but I also think we should get a fair share of assets, and you don't have one without the other.
Ruth Davidson. Order.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The people of Scotland have been waiting a long time to get answers on what independence might look like. And I think people right across the country will have looked at the launch of this white paper today and have thought, is this it? Is this why we should break apart a United Kingdom that Scotland has spent 300 years helping to build? Is this why we should sacrifice one half of our shared nationhood, our dual identity? Is this why we should walk away? And the truth is, there was very little new that we hadn't heard here before. Little except that pledge on childcare. Now, for 6 years, the Deputy First Minister has sat in a Scottish Government with full powers over childcare. And for 6 years, the Scottish Conservatives, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats have been urging her government to give more help with childcare to Scottish families. And now, suddenly, after 6 years, we get this promise. And it was illuminating, Presiding Officer. It was illuminating that when the Deputy First Minister was asked this morning why, in 6 years, she had not helped families in this way when she had the powers to do so, she answered that she hadn't helped when she could because the tax receipts of women going back to work would have gone to the UK Treasury. Now, if the Deputy First Minister wants to prove that this pledge isn't retail politics, it isn't jotted down on the back of a fag packet, can she tell us how much this policy would cost? How much per year 1,140 hours of childcare for all children from age 1 to school will cost, and why is the costing not in the document?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, can I say firstly to Ruth Davidson that I'll be happy to allow the people of Scotland to judge this document. That's why we are taking great pains to make sure that everybody has access to a copy. I said in my statement, our message is read the document and make up your own minds. The question for the other side of the debate is where is your equivalent? We now have the case for independence. Where is the case for the no proposition? On the specific issue of childcare, I think it's quite interesting that Ruth Davidson comes to this chamber and completely distorts a quote that I gave on the radio this morning. But anyway, we'll put that to one side. The fact of the matter is this government has been increasing childcare provision all through the time we have been in government, and we're continuing to do it right now. But if we want to make not just incremental increases, but make a transformational change in the provision of childcare, then we do need to access the increased revenues that flow from that policy. If we were able, just as an example, to bring our levels of female participation in the workforce to the level of, say, Sweden, a comparable independent country, we'd have increased tax revenues in the region of £700 million every year. That's the kind of revenue that then funds that policy. That's the reason you need independent to do this. And if Ruth Davidson had been watching, as I'm sure she was, the live stream of the launch this morning, should have heard me give the answers to the question about costing. Part 2 of this document sets out how we will deliver our priorities within sound public finances. £100 million within our first budget for phase 1, £600 million by the time we get to the end of that first Parliament. And by then, we see these increased revenues from having more women able to participate in the workforce. It's the kind of ambitious transformational, life-changing policy that independence gives us the ability to do. And if the opposition would raise their sights and raise their ambition, they might find it within themselves to support it.
Order. Can I advise members that I have 20 members who wish to ask a question? It is unlikely I'm going to get through everybody, but if the questions are brief and the answers are brief, then we might make considerable progress. Can I remind members we are having a debate tomorrow, so can you keep the questions as questions and answers as brief as possible? Thank you. Can I now call Bruce Crawford?
Presiding Officer, the thing that excites me most about independence is the opportunity to make transformational changes to both our society and our economy. That's why I welcome so much the commitment in regard to childcare in Scotland's future. And can the Deputy First Minister provide more detail about how, with independence, we can transform childcare provision in Scotland, and explain to the doomsayers in the Better Together campaign how this policy will not only help Scottish families, but help the Scottish economy and create jobs to boot?
Deputy First Minister.
Bruce Crawford, I think, asks an excellent question, because he highlights exactly what people out there want to hear and want to know. They want to know what the benefits of independence are to them, to their families, to their communities. And this childcare proposal is one that would benefit families the length and breadth of this country. It would give our youngest people, our children, the best start in life, but it would give parents, in particular women, the opportunities that many of them are priced out of just now because of the prohibitive costs of childcare, the opportunity to participate in the workforce. And it would grow the economy and increase revenues as well, allowing us to make that policy affordable and sustainable. And incidentally, into the bargain, the fact of delivering this kind of transformational childcare policy would create 35,000 new jobs, the people needed to look after the children. This is the kind of ambitious policy that I believe will galvanise this campaign and be at the heart of the debate as we move forward towards the referendum.
Bruce Smith, followed by Linda Fabiani.
Thank you very much. Presiding Officer, does the Deputy First Minister accept that the people of England, Wales and Northern Ireland have a right to say no to a Eurozone-style currency union? And is she listening and is she hearing the many voices from England, Wales and Northern Ireland who are saying that it is seriously unlikely?
Deputy First Minister.
No, I hear no politicians say that, because they are in a campaign trying to persuade people to vote no, so it hardly comes as a surprise. I mean, can I say to Drew Scott, we're not talking about a Eurozone-style shared currency. Scotland and the rest of the UK has been described by a range of eminent experts as an optimal currency zone, unlike the Eurozone, where the richest parts of Germany and the poorest parts of Greece are coexisting within a currency. But the reasons why I believe this is the right policy, as I've already said, are not just because it's in the best interests of Scotland, but because it's in the best interests of people in other parts of the UK. And perhaps those on the other side of the argument would care to take the time to explain why on earth a Westminster government would want to say to its own businesses that export into Scotland, no, Scotland wants to stay in a currency with you, but we're going to force you into the transaction costs, the lost jobs that would come from having a separate currency. Why would a Westminster government want to put to one side and take out of its balance of payments the £40 billion that flow from our oil and gas exports? This is a sensible, common sense, rational, reasonable proposition. That's perhaps why the No campaign don't recognise it.
Linda Fabiani, followed by Willie Rennie.
What's that mean?
Fabiani.
Sorry, Presiding Officer, I found it difficult to hear there. As we know, Presiding Officer, UK civil service jobs continue to be cut by Westminster, in contrast to the Scottish Government's policy here of no compulsory redundancies. This does affect the East Kilbride constituency, so may I ask the Deputy First Minister what Scotland's future says about improving job security?
Deputy First Minister.
Can I refer Linda Fabiani to two particular parts of the White Paper, page 365 and part 4 of the White Paper, which detail some of the workforce issues in terms of the transfer of civil service and public service employees from UK Government employment into Scottish Government employment, where they would, for example, get the benefit of the no compulsory redundancy policy that we have, but the UK Government doesn't have. And secondly, she might with our constituency responsibilities, be interested in page 49 of the document, which is in part 1, where it makes clear that Scotland's military HQ would be at Faslane, but with delivery functions in East Kilbride. I'm sure she'll find that of interest.
Will Rennie, followed by Graham Pearson.
I like optimism as much as the Deputy First Minister, but she must be the only person on the planet who believes that there is not one single downside to independence worth mentioning in the White Paper, and that dozens of other countries and organisations will agree to every single demand of hers on the currency, on NATO, on the EU and so much more. Yet, if she is wrong, this is the gamble she is taking, and it's the gamble that Scotland will pay the price for. One area in which she is definitely wrong is on childcare. The Scottish Government has the worst childcare arrangements in the British Isles, and yet the Deputy First Minister has said that she is delaying the introduction of early education for 2-year-olds until after the referendum, even though it has already been delivered with the powers in England. She has the powers now. Why the delay?
Deputy First Minister.
Firstly, can I say to Willie Rennie, in response to the first part of his question, we, like every other country in the world, live in a world that is at times difficult, challenging and uncertain. But I happen to believe that just as this is true for every other independent country in the world, in that uncertain world, it is always better to be in the driving seat of your own destiny than leave the decisions to be taken elsewhere. So that's why I believe that in any circumstances it is better to be independent. Secondly, on the currency union, there were two words I forgot to use in describing a currency union. Those two words were logical and desirable. These aren't actually my words. These are the words of Alistair Darling when he was telling the truth about it before the No campaign got hold of him and made him change his tune. And in respect of childcare, Willie Rennie is just wrong about the Scottish Government's childcare position. I seem to recall it was his UK leader, Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK Government, that at one point was forced to speak out against the childcare policy of his own government. We are making progressive changes to the provision of childcare, but we want to transform the provision of childcare. And if Willie Rennie has been listening to this session so far, as I'm sure he has, he will know why we need the powers of independence to do that, so that we can provide that policy, grow revenues and allow those revenues to make that policy sustainable and affordable. I believe this is the policy that will capture the imagination of people around Scotland, and Willie Rennie, given his creditable track record on this issue, I think would be better advised to get behind it.
Graham Pearson, followed by Ailey MacLeod.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Will the Deputy First Minister tell us what discussions she has had with her opposite numbers at Westminster in relation to the delivery of national security? The document indicates government's first responsibility to reflect MI5, MI6, GCHQ and national cyber threats with her security and intelligence agency and give us confidence of her costings.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I know Graham Pearson, with his interest and his expertise on these issues, will be interested to read the document from page 261 onwards, which sets out the proposals around security and intelligence, including the establishment of a new security and intelligence agency. On the issue of discussions with Westminster counterparts, I'm glad he raised this issue, because I've said repeatedly, and I'll say again today, that I would welcome discussions with UK counterparts about how we do take forward negotiations in the event of a yes vote next year. Now, I'm not expecting we pre-negotiate the entire independence settlement, but it would be in everybody's interest for us to have sensible discussions. The position of the Westminster Government is that they're not prepared to have those discussions. So if Graham Pearson wants to take the matter up with the Westminster Government and encourage them to change their tune, then I'd be very happy for him to do so. And I, the Government and an entire civil service are at their disposal to sit down and talk about these issues any time they like.
Ailey MacLeod, followed by Jackie Bailey.
Does the Deputy First Minister agree with me that at a time when the UK Government is seriously contemplating UK withdrawal from the EU, that Scotland's future inside the EU can only be guaranteed by independence, and that under any scenario, an independent Scottish Government taking its place at the EU top table is the only way of ensuring that Scotland's best interests are represented in EU legislative and policy decisions?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I'll make 2 points in response to Aileen's question, which I think is an absolutely vital question in terms of Scotland's representation within the European Union. Firstly, our interests would be much better served by independent membership of the European Union. And anybody who doubts that would only need to speak to Richard Lockhead, I'm not sure if he's in the chamber just now, about the disgraceful situation around agriculture payments over the last few weeks when Scotland's interests were not served by the UK Government. And the second point is absolutely the correct one. The risk to Scotland's membership of the European Union is not independence. The risk is the in-out referendum being proposed by David Cameron and the Conservatives and the UK Government. That is the risk. If Scotland doesn't become independent, then there is a very real risk that in that referendum, the UK as a whole votes to come out, Scotland votes to stay in, and we get taken out of the European Union against our will, with all of the serious implications for our economy. That's the risk to Scotland, and that's one of the many reasons we should vote yes in the referendum.
Jackie Baillie, followed by Stuart Maxwell.
The Deputy First Minister will know that pensions make up about 40% of the social security budget, but not one word about pensions in the statement. Is it because she has no answers? No answers on how cross-border pension schemes will be funded? No answer to the fact that pensions will cost more in Scotland due to the population ageing faster? And no answer to the cost of pensions overall? Isn't it the case that the Office for National Statistics, the National Records of Scotland, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the Scottish Government's own Fiscal Commission, and even John Swinney acknowledged that maintaining pensions in an independent Scotland would present a huge problem? Isn't it true that the pensioners in Scotland do face a stark choice? They can either believe the facts from experts or believe the assertions from the SNP.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I know it's only been a few hours since the document was published, and Jackie Baillie may not have had time to read it yet, but I would recommend to her pages 138 onwards, which sets out in detail the position around pensions. Let me give her just some highlights. Current pensioners will receive their pensions as now, on time and in full. Accrued rights will be honoured and protected. Planned reform, single-tier pension will be rolled out. This triple lock will be guaranteed for the first term of an independent parliament. No such guarantee currently exists from Westminster. Let me make a couple of other points about pensions. Right now, we pay a smaller proportion of our GDP on social protection, including things like pensions, than is the case in the UK as a whole. So we start from a stronger, more affordable position. We have an ageing population. We're not unique in that, and actually it's a good thing. It's something we should celebrate, not moan about. Now, you can argue about whether our population, our ageing population, is a more acute problem for Scotland than in other countries. Actually, the proportion of our population over pension age is increasing slightly lower than the UK. If you look at our dependency ratio, if you take the whole dependency ratio, it's better. If you look at the dependency ratio just for pensioners, it's slightly worse. But the key point is this. The key point is this. What do we do about it? The way you deal with an ageing population, the way you support an ageing population, is to grow your working age population. How do you do that? You attract immigration rather than the UK Government's policies to try to, for example, get rid of the post-study visa. You take measures to grow your economy, to create jobs, to grow tax revenues. That's how you deal with and support an ageing population, and we're far better able to do it with independence than we will be as part of the Union.
Stuart Maxwell, followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Deputy First Minister agree with me that one of the biggest gains of independence is a social security system that is in line with the wishes of the people of Scotland? And can the Deputy First Minister outline what measures are set out in the White Paper to achieve this fair and prosperous future?
Deputy First Minister.
I can thank the member for that question and refer him to Part 3, Chapter 4, where our proposals on welfare and social protection are set out. I do agree that the Westminster assault on our welfare state is one of the many reasons for supporting independence. Our welfare state, cherished by all of us, is being dismantled by the Westminster Government before our very eyes. And if we want to protect it, then the best way to protect it is to vote yes. We set out some very clear policies in this White Paper. We will abolish the bedroom tax within the first year of being elected as the first government of an independent Scotland. We will take the decision not to proceed with universal credit and personal independence payments. These are programmes mired in controversy, delayed and seriously damaging to some of the most vulnerable in our society. And we will build on the work being done by the expert group in welfare to make sure we can design a social protection system that is fit for Scotland's purposes, that helps people into work but provides the decent safety net for those who can't, that I believe we all want to see.
Ian Gray, followed by Annabel Goldie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On page 305 of the White Paper, it says that the Scottish Government would look to establish an oil fund immediately on independence to stabilise the economy. What it doesn't say is where the money for that fund will come from. So will it come from... No, it doesn't.
Order! Order! Let us hear the member. Order.
I think you'll find it doesn't say where the money for that fund will come from. So the question is, will it come from increased taxation? Will it come from cuts in public spending? Or do they seriously propose, as is rather implied, do they seriously propose to borrow the money to save in an oil fund in the world's biggest payday loan? Surely that's not the common sense so beloved of the Deputy First Minister.
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I would point out to Ian Gray that Norway established its oil fund some years before it started paying into the oil fund. In case he's forgotten this fact, Norway, independent Norway, now has an oil fund of £450 billion. That's one of the very big benefits of being independent. Now, in relation to Ian Gray's questions, the thing is, Ian Gray knows the answer to these questions, because I'm sure, being the careful, prepared person that he is, that he's read the Fiscal Commission's work on the oil fund. It proposes an oil fund with two purposes. One, to smooth the volatility of oil revenues. We would make a cautious forecast of oil revenues, and when the actual revenues exceed that, we would put the excess into an oil fund. And secondly, we would have an oil fund with the purpose of saving for future generations, something that Westminster governments over generations have failed to do, and we would start paying into that when the deficit reached a point below 3%. That is very, very clear. But you know, the key thing here is this: if we leave Westminster in charge, then the next however many years of our oil revenues will be squandered in the same way as the last 40 years have been squandered. If we are independent, we can steward them for the future. Yet another reason to vote yes and become independent.
Annabel Goldie, followed by Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Whatever Alex Salmond says, an independent Scotland using the pound is not under his control. It will be under the control of a foreign country. Now, the White Paper at page 111 concedes the possibility of, and I quote, a different arrangement. If the currency negotiations to use the pound fail, can the Deputy First Minister please clarify what is the different arrangement? Is it the euro, the groat, the Aberdeen dollar? What is Plan B?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, the point Annabel Goldie draws attention to about different arrangements simply acknowledges the fact that in future in an independent Scotland, some parties, I see Patrick Harvey here in the chamber, might take a different view on the best currency arrangement for Scotland. I know that Willie Rennie's party, as recently as the 2010 general election, had entry to the euro still as their preferred currency option. So clearly there are differences of opinion in the No campaign on what the best currency option is. Our view, our firm view, is that a shared currency is in the best interests of Scotland and in the best interests of the UK. And I would have thought Annabel Goldie, whose party gave Alistair Darling such a warm standing ovation when he came to their conference, would agree with Alistair Darling that it's both logical and desirable.
Patricia Ferguson, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Deputy First Minister advise the Chamber what discussions have taken place with EU member states to back up the statement that in order to ensure the current UK obligations and provisions apply to independent Scotland, the, I quote, necessary treaty amendments will be taken forward with the agreement of member states? In the event that the consent of EU member states has not already been obtained, does she agree that it would be more honest for the document to explore what concessions might have to be made in order to secure EU membership? And can she indicate to the Chamber which of the UK opt-outs she would be prepared to concede in order to ensure Scotland's membership?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, can I say to Patricia Ferguson, we have discussions with different EU members on a range of issues on a range of different occasions. Fiona Hislop will be briefing the Consular Corps, for example, over the next couple of days on the content of the White Paper. She will be as aware as I am that no other European member state would want to be seen to see anything that could be deemed to be interfering in the domestic debate that Scotland is having. We have, and this goes back to an answer I gave earlier on, we would be very happy to sit down and discuss these matters with the European Commission. The Commission has made clear those discussions would have to be initiated by the member state, which is the UK, and we're back to the point the UK, for reasons best known to itself, doesn't want to discuss these issues, perhaps because they know that the position of the Scottish Government is a sound one. But, you know, the question that the No campaign has to answer is why on earth would any member of the European Union not want Scotland to continue in membership? Scotland is a contributor to the European Union in many, many different ways, and it would be in the interests of Scotland and other EU members that that continued. And in terms of her question about opt-outs, and I'm sure she will, if she hasn't already, read the detail of this in the White Paper, we're arguing for a transition on the basis of continuity of effect. We're not asking for special arrangements to apply to Scotland. We're arguing for the same arrangements that apply to us now as part of the UK to continue when we are an independent country. Again, that is a reasonable and sensible position, as are all the positions laid out in this comprehensive document published today.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Patrick Harvie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Deputy First Minister what analysis is carried out in the White Paper as to the opportunities of independence to reverse the trend of widening inequality, which has been presided over by successive Westminster governments of whatever political hue, decade in and decade out?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, the inequality gap in the UK is again one of the reasons why I think we need power over the levers of social and economic policy to try to deal with that. I've already spoken about the childcare proposal, which I think would have a huge effect over time on raising attainment and dealing with some of that inequality gap. We also set out proposals, for example, to ensure that the minimum wage rises at least in line with inflation. The tax credits and benefits rise at least in line with inflation. Why is that important? Because it stops the lowest paid in our society falling further and deeper into poverty. So there's a range of measures in here that not overnight, but over time, will address that inequality gap in Scotland and help to make our country not just wealthier but fairer as well. And it's that ambition for a wealthier and fairer country that drives everything in this White Paper and our support for that independence that we seek.
Patrick Harvie, followed by Fiona MacLeod.
Thank you. I would love to fund a childcare revolution by scrapping the weapons of war instead of cutting other public services. But even if the Better Together parties don't share the desire for the freedom to make that choice, doesn't it show the depths to which they have sunk that they describe that proposal as a childcare bribe? Since when did any politician with any integrity describe public services in such a demeaning term?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, can I agree 100% with Patrick Harvie on that? I think it is a sign of where things have come to when we don't just have Conservative politicians describing public service policies like childcare, universal childcare in these terms, which perhaps doesn't come as a huge surprise, but we have Labour politicians queuing up to join them in doing so. The Better Together Labour-Tory alliance that wants to hold Scotland back. I'm proud to be part of a cross-party Yes campaign that wants to take Scotland forward to a better future.
Fiona MacLeod, followed by Duncan McNeill.
I'm sure the Deputy First Minister, like me, believes that Democrats across this chamber and around Scotland will be incredibly excited by the opportunity that independence gives Scotland to finally have a written constitution. given the historic and social significance of this, I wonder if I could ask the Deputy First Minister what thoughts have been given to make this a truly participative process with innovative forms of engagement techniques so that everyone can feel and be part of the process of writing this constitution.
Deputy First Minister.
Fiona MacLeod, I think, raises one of the genuinely exciting opportunities of being independent, the chance to have the opportunity to design a written constitution. We are one of the only countries, certainly in Europe and the world, that doesn't have a written constitution, setting out clearly the relationship between the citizen and the state, protecting our freedoms and our rights. We've been very clear as a government the kind of things we would want to see in that written constitution: social and economic rights, a ban on nuclear weapons, for example. But this is not a written constitution that should be written by the Scottish Government. It should be one that is written in a collaborative and participative way, and Part 4 of the White Paper sets out that process. But that will be a process that should be determined by the independent Scottish Parliament elected in 2016. And if we get that yes vote and become independent, certainly look forward to being part of, but only part of, that exciting process.
Duncan McNeill, followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Only 12 days ago, Deputy First Minister, you said that shipbuilding was dear to your heart. Shipbuilding was vital to the Scottish economy. 170,000 words later, can the 35 words that refer to shipbuilding in any way at all match up to a new future or even a sustainable future? Where are the assurances and the guarantees for my constituents who work in Govan, Scotland and Rosyth that the industry will have a secure future in an independent Scotland?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, shipbuilding is very dear to my heart, which is why I always try to avoid taking any opportunity to use it as a political football. I actually think shipbuilding is more important than that. What this white paper does is two things. It sets out, in some detail when you go through the defence part of it, it sets out what the procurement requirements, initial procurement requirements will be for independent Scottish Defence Forces. It talks about something, frankly, that has been talked about far too little within the Westminster system: diversification in terms of defence and the shipbuilding industry. And of course, I will repeat what I've said previously. Post-independence, the Clyde will remain, as it is today, the best place to build the Type 26 frigates. Alistair Carmichael, I think, said, and I hope he's regretting saying this now, that Article 346 of the European Union Treaty somehow prevented the UK Government placing these contracts in the Clyde. He sat next to a Defence Minister at a House of Commons committee just a couple of weeks ago, where the Defence Minister contradicted him and said there was nothing that prevented these contracts being placed on the Clyde. They will come to the Clyde because the Clyde is the best place with the best people and the best facilities to build them, and it would make sense, given the details set out in here, for that in future post-independence to be a joint procurement. And remember, joint procurement in the interest of cost effectiveness is what the UK Government goes on about all the time.
Jim Eadie, followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Following a yes vote, what further steps will the Scottish Government take to realise Scotland's ambition to be an active and good global citizen?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, in the section of the document that deals with international relations and defence, it sets out in detail our commitments around international aid. Just as I believe we have a responsibility to the poorest in our own country, so too as a relatively rich country do we have a responsibility to the poorest around the world. So we set out here our commitment to secure and ensure the 0.7% of GNI in terms of international aid and a range of other ways in which we would work with international partners to be that good global citizen, to help to tackle global poverty, climate change, build on the world-leading work this Parliament has already done around climate change, and the opportunities of independence in that are many and they are varied.
Malcolm Chisholm, followed by Margaret MacDonald.
Can I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's aspirations on childcare, although I would give more emphasis to 2-year-olds and do it now. But how could she deliver that? Or how could she deliver that or any of her other spending wishes with a neoliberal economic policy, higher interest rates and a hope for the best relationship with the rest of the UK? Does she not realise how absurd the Government looks when the White Paper says the Bank of England will be a lender of last resort? And does she not understand that even if there was a currency union, there would be no fiscal independence, contrary to what she said on the radio this morning. Is she not leading Project Wish against Project Reality, as will become increasingly clear over the months ahead?
Deputy First Minister. Order. Order.
I understand the vehemence with which Malcolm Chisholm makes his argument, because as somebody who has got the greatest of respect for Malcolm Chisholm, I've got a sneaky wee feeling he doesn't actually believe it in his heart of hearts. And actually, he'll be as inspired by this as I am. I don't know where the higher interest rates that were just chucked into that question came from. I think he's perhaps been reading the Project Fear playbook a little too much. Independence offers us the opportunity in Scotland to take the steps that get our economy growing, that create jobs, that creates the wealth for us then to share that wealth more equally and deal with the inequality that I know Malcolm Chisholm loathes as much as I do. And I tell you something, I haven't given up hope yet and will not give up hope before the 18th of September next year in getting Malcolm Chisholm onto the yes side of this debate, where his heart,
Margaret MacDonald, followed by Christina McKelvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I first of all congratulate the Government on producing what I think is a very workmanlike document. It's going to start many of the debates, I hope, that we should be having in Scotland. But can I also gently say that she shouldn't dismiss what Malcolm Chisholm has just said, because that's what a lot of us feel, that it looks too easy. Now, we know it's going to be difficult, and that's where you get to negotiations. And so when we're talking about negotiations, shouldn't we be thinking of tapping into all of the talent, all of the experience that there will be in Scotland after the yes vote? There are people who have been in the front benches of cabinets. There are people who have done the international negotiations. They're called Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling. I would leave out one or two others. But I quite seriously urge on the Government, think of the whole country, not just of the Scottish National Party.
Deputy First Minister.
I made a speech, I think, around about a year ago just now, where I set out very clearly that while, if we get a yes vote, this government, as the democratically elected government of Scotland, would lead the negotiations, we would do so as part of a Team Scotland approach. I would very much want to see people like Alistair Darling, Gordon Brown, Margaret MacDonald in those negotiations with us, making sure that all of us on Scotland's side get the best deal for Scotland that we possibly can. And that, I think, is a key point in this debate. We will have the yes-no debate, and we will have it passionately over these next few months, and we will be on opposite sides, those of us in this chamber. But the minute Scotland votes yes, we stop being on opposite sides. We're all on the same side, and it's on the same side that we then have the opportunity to take our country forward. So I agree 100% with the proposition that Margaret MacDonald has put forward.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Given that women in Scotland need to worry just as much about the sticky floor than the glass ceiling, can I ask the Deputy First Minister what proposals are set out in the White Paper to increase female participation in the workforce, and what impact these proposals would have on the economy of an independent Scotland?
Deputy First Minister.
Well, I've obviously spoken at some length today about the childcare proposal, which would do great things to help women participate in the workforce. We've also talked in here about what we would try to do to increase women's representation on company and public boards, and legislate for that if necessary, because one of the practical things that transfers from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament with independence, of course, is legal responsibility for equality issues, and that is one of the perhaps little things that won't get the headlines in this White Paper that I think is absolutely worth supporting.
Thank you. That ends the statement from the Deputy First Minister. We now move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8389. In the name of Alex Neil and the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Bill, members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now. Can I advise members that time for this debate is extremely tight? Can you keep to your time limits, and we will get through calling all the speakers. I now call on Alex Neil to speak to a move of the motion. Cabinet Secretary, you have 13 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Can I first of all say that I am very pleased to open this debate on stage one of the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Bill, and I would like to start by thanking Duncan McNeill and the Health and Sport Committee for the scrutiny of the bill and for preparing their stage one report with its interesting and welcome recommendations. I also thank the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, the Finance Committee and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee for their consideration of the bill and for contributing to the scrutiny of it by the Health and Sport Committee. I am also grateful to partner organisations across the National Health Service and local government and the third and independent sectors, and to the broad range of stakeholder working groups that have helped the Scottish Government develop the policy reflected in the bill, and to those organisations and individuals who provided oral and written evidence on the bill at committee. And I am sure the Parliament will wish to join with me in acknowledging and welcoming these contributions. Integrating health and social care in Scotland, by definition, requires a good team effort, and that is exactly what this work by a very wide margin of it's been done by a very wide margin of people and organisations represents. I am, of course, pleased that the Health and Sport Committee welcomed the bill in its Stage 1 report and recommended that the Parliament approve its general principles. The committee raised a number of questions on specific issues and asked for further clarification on a range of points. I am grateful for the careful scrutiny applied by the committee, which I have responded to in reply to my Stage 1 report. Presiding Officer, I would like to begin by capturing once again the essence of what this legislation is about, why it is needed as a matter of urgency, and why the principles that underpin it command widespread support. The 2011 census showed us that for the first time, Scotland's population included more people aged over 65 than there were people aged under 15. We all know that statistic represents an extraordinary achievement on the part of our health and social care services, which have helped to enable so many people to live longer, healthier lives in Scotland. But I need to remind no one of the challenges that an ageing population brings as we consider how best we should plan and deliver services in the future. In particular, as more people live longer with multiple conditions and complex needs, we must ensure that the health and social care support on which their well-being relies works seamlessly, effectively and efficiently. And that is why we are integrating health and social care to improve outcomes for the growing numbers of people who need both health and social care support, most of whom have multiple complex needs, some of whom are older, and all of whom should have access to the right care at the right time in the right place. Too often people are admitted to hospital or to a care home when care provision and support in the community would result in better outcomes for them. Too often the system is not configured to provide the right care in the right place at the right time. Did I hear an
Maureen
intervention? Sorry.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Does he agree with me that in relation to the integration of health and social care, it's also important, in the point he's just mentioned, that registered social landlords, for example, and adaptations to those houses is just as important as is indeed community transport?
Absolutely, and it's very important that services, vital services, like housing and transport, are actively involved in the partnerships and feed into the design and commissioning of the services that we are talking about. As I said, too often people are admitted to hospital or to a care home where care provision and support in the community would result in better outcomes for them. And too often the system is not configured to provide that right care in the right place at the right time. Too often people's independence and well-being are diminished too early or to too great an extent by an over-reliance on institutional care. We all accept that it's our responsibility as a Parliament to tackle these challenges, not least because the costs and consequences are not limited to the individuals involved. The consequences of our failure in Scotland to use different types of care and support to best effect undermine our entire health and social care system and are shared by everyone, as public sector resources are spent in activities that do not deliver maximum possible benefit. The solution to many of these challenges is strong, effective leadership from clinicians and care professionals, from people working in the National Health Service and local government and in the third and independent sectors, and by no means least from party and Parliament itself, which is why this legislation is both necessary and important. This government is committed to establishing a public service landscape in which different public bodies are required to work together and with their partners in the third and independent sectors to remove unhelpful barriers and use their pooled resources for the greater benefit of patients, service users, carers and families. And that is fundamental to the ethos and ambition of this bill. I will now spell out in some context about the bill's provisions. Presiding Officer, as I have already stated, and as the Stage 1 report by the committee reiterates, there is a clear need for legislation to provide the framework for driving forward change, because not enough progress has been made under the current permissive legislation. The purpose of this bill is exactly that, to establish that framework for integrating health and social care and to improve the quality and consistency of services by focusing on improving outcomes for service users, carers and their families. The bill will foster an environment that encourages constructive culture change by requiring health boards and local authorities to establish integrated partnership arrangements and work more closely together from day to day and via medium and short-term joint strategic planning arrangements. Evidence shows us that effective integration depends particularly on 4 key features. 1. Local systems must plan together for shared populations of need. In other words, health and social care, with their third and independent sector partners, must plan together for people with complex needs and not do so separately and in isolation from each other. Secondly, resources must be pooled to deliver population-based plans, which is why integrated budgets will be so important. Thirdly, clinicians and other professionals must be closely involved and leading the design and planning of local services. And fourthly, leadership, both local and national, must be strong, effective and consistent. This bill is built directly from these 4 features of well-integrated systems. In terms of overarching arrangements for integration, the bill provides for local flexibility and leadership to determine which approach to integration is most appropriate to local circumstances. 2 models are provided: delegation between partners, lead agency arrangements, and delegation to a body corporate. And it will be up to each area to decide which is appropriate for them. Having set up the integrated partnership arrangement, health boards and local authorities will then be required to delegate adult health and social care functions and budgets to the integrated partnership. By bringing together integrated governance, integrated strategic planning and integrated budgets, we will create not only the environment for improving outcomes, but also for greater financial accountability by reducing the opportunities and indeed the incentives for cost shunting between organisations. It is my intention to propose an amendment at stage 2 of the bill process that will set out on the face of the bill that only adult social care functions and therefore budgets must be included in the integrated arrangement. Regulations will set out the types of adult health care and therefore budgets for integration. These will include adult primary and community health care and, importantly, aspects of acute hospital care that offer the best opportunities for service redesign in favour of prevention and anticipatory care in the community. The bill requires each integration authority to put in place a strategic commissioning plan for the integrated services. Strategic planning lies at the heart of the process of reform, and the bill is clear on the broad extent of consultation required to ensure strategic planning is robust and effective. A key feature of strategic planning arrangements is the bill's requirement on the Integration Authority to establish locality planning arrangements which will provide a forum for local clinical and professional leadership of service planning. Where the body corporate model is used, a chief officer must be appointed by the Integration Authority to ensure integrated oversight of strategic planning, budget management and service delivery. To facilitate these changes, community health partnerships will be removed from statute and national outcomes for health and well-being will be established via secondary legislation after consultation. Integration authorities will be required to publish a performance report to provide accountability and transparency for delivery against the national outcomes and any further outcomes agreed upon locally. The bill does not sit in isolation. It fits within a wider agenda of public service reform currently taking place in Scotland. Reforms in other areas, including the Self-Directed Support Act, the Children and Young People Bill, and the changes we're planning to community planning, all serve to complement the work of this bill, and this bill will in turn reinforce that wider programme of reform for the benefit of our population. Through the creation of an integrated health and social care budget and a single set of joint outcomes, integration creates a positive policy environment for health boards to play an integral part in self-directed support policy and practice, and it's vital we take full opportunity of that advantage. The planning requirements of the bill, should local authorities and health boards decide to include children's health and social care in their integrated arrangement services, will feed into the development of the plans required of the Children and Young People Bill currently before Parliament. Like other public sector bodies, integration authorities will be expected to play a strong and effective role in supporting the work of community planning to achieve better outcomes for communities on shared priorities. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, this bill deals with a number of important, albeit complex, issues. This debate provides an important opportunity for Parliament to consider this legislation and the challenges to which it responds in some depth. There is wide agreement, I believe, within the Chamber and beyond, with the aims of integration and the broad principles that underpin this. As Bob Doris, Deputy Convener of the Health and Sport Committee, put it in relation to the Stage 1 Committee report, while this legislation is not a panacea, it will provide a focus for cementing and reinforcing progress that has already been made. Presiding Officer, I agree with that, and I look forward to working with members from all sides of the Chamber to take this legislation through Parliament, and I move the motion to adopt Stage 1 in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call on Duncan McNeill to speak on behalf of the Health and Sport Committee. Up to 9 minutes, please, Mr McNeill.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this debate as convener of the Health and Sport Committee. And I'd like to begin by expressing my thanks and those of the committee to all who gave written evidence and indeed who came along to the committee evidence sessions. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the clerks and Spice team for all the help that they gave the committee through that procedure. Members of the committee also undertook fact-finding missions and visits to West Lothian and Highlands to see integration in action, and we appreciate the welcome we got at those visits. I'm also grateful to Lothian Centre for Inclusive Living, which hosted an event for service users and carers representing a full range of disabled people's organisations. And finally, I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for his engagement with the committee and for his written responses to our report. Presiding Officer, this bill brings about big changes in how health and social care services are structured and managed. It requires a change in working practices amongst frontline staff, identifying new ways of working across teams and departments. This is an area that the committee has looked at previously. 2 years ago, an inquiry into the regulation of care for older people highlighted the increasing shift to the provision of care in a person's home rather in a care home setting. In anticipation of the integration process, we called for a review of the national care standards, which would embed such principles of independent living into the framework for the delivery of care services. And we would welcome some progress in this area. In this legislation, we rightly see a similar shift in emphasis from acute to community-based care. The Royal College of GPs recognises that the need for integration in responding to the growing older population. But there remains a good deal of concern that GPs may not have adequate resources to fully participate in the design and planning of the new joint working arrangements. The Cabinet Secretary is currently engaged in discussions on a renewed GP contract, and I'd ask him to report back to the committee in due course on the role that it will play in encouraging GPs to fully immerse themselves in the integration process. I also note that the Scottish Government's intention to bring forward legislation to support carers through integration, but I'd like to see more detail on the face of the bill. The bill has been drafted in the spirit of Christie Commission, and that it seeks to tackle what Christie referred to as the unduly cluttered and fragmented public services landscape. All of this, of course, comes against a backdrop of an older population and the increasing demand on our public services to deliver more with less. In a healthcare setting, that marries with the objective of reducing bed blocking. Christie also suggested that changes need to be driven by how we can achieve more positive outcomes. That is a theme to which I'll return to later in the speech. Our report highlighted a number of areas where we seek clarification from the Government on the effect of this legislation. Andrew Eccles of the Glasgow School of Social Work suggested a need to be more subtle and complex engagement with some of the issues. The themes of strong leadership, as mentioned earlier, cultural change came up repeatedly in the evidence to the committee. There is clearly need, therefore, for a committed engagement amongst all involved in these processes. Health boards and local authorities are required to identify the structures that best suits their circumstances. Most areas have adopted for the body corporate, while so far only Highland region has adopted the lead agency model. The vast majority of evidence has been supportive of both approaches. I do think that further clarity is required, however, on how the body corporate model will operate. How will the health boards, local authorities and the new joint boards work together in practice? In particular, there appear to be some concerns in regard to the transfer of funding from acute budgets to social services. Concern has also been recorded amongst recipients of social care services about charging for care services when NHS services are, of course, free at the point of use. The committee has heard that around half of the total health board budgets will be included under the scope of integrated plans, but there is a real concern out there that the potential for cost creep on the cost of obtaining social care services. I think it's important that users of these services receive assurances that they are not going to be hit with additional charges. Presiding Officer, the bill contains significant powers for Scottish ministers. In evidence to the committee, the Cabinet Secretary helpfully noted his intention to bring forward amendments at stage 2, which would seek to mitigate the fear held by COSLA and others that too much power was being given to ministers. That is a helpful and constructive offer from the Cabinet Secretary, and I look forward to those amendments coming forward. Presiding Officer, I want to move on to what I consider the most important aspects of the bill. Not only does this legislation seek to encourage health and care providers to work closer together, it seeks to improve the outcomes available to patients and service users. It is those outcomes that are of crucial importance. This legislation is to be commended for closing the gap between the provision of health and social care. It is of paramount importance that it makes it easier for patients and their carers to access the services that they need. For that reason, Presiding Officer, our report highlighted the need for continuous commitment to improving individual outcomes. And I look forward to seeing more detail at stage 2 of how that important aim will be achieved. Whilst the bill rightly focuses on the provision of services, we should never forget the important role played by the third sector and the independent providers. We heard repeated pleas from providers and their service users for assurances that they would be represented in a new integrated board structures. The committee, we accepted that this is by no means a straightforward issue and that the government has set out good reasons as to why this might not be possible. However, I would call on the Cabinet Secretary to give due consideration to how the involvement of the third and independent sectors can be strengthened within the bill. Integration is a process that is already well underway. The committee agrees that we are heading in the right direction. But to all those individuals and organisations that contribute to our report, to all the staff who are affected by these changes, and most importantly of all, to the patients and carers whose quality of life depends on high-quality delivery of health and care services, this Parliament has a duty to ensure that this bill delivers for Scotland's patients and carers. And we will ensure that its implementation receives appropriate scrutiny. Presiding Officer, on that basis, the Health and Sport Committee recommends that the general principles of the Public Bodies Joint Work in Scotland Bill be approved. Thank you.
Many thanks. And as we are very tight for time this afternoon, I want to make speakers aware now that speeches will be restricted to 5 minutes in the open debate. I now call on Neil Findlay. Up to 9 minutes, please, Mr Findlay.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. From the outset, I would like to state that we will support this bill at decision time, as we agree with the broad principles of it. As a West Lothian councillor for 9 years from 2003, I saw how cultural change, cooperation and political vision by the then Labour group on the council in 2003 advanced integration without any need for legislation. However, it's my view that the issue of social care in Scotland is one of the scandals of our time, swept under the carpet and kept away as much as possible from prying eyes. Today we sit in this Parliament and pretend that all is reasonably well and that with this legislation things will be okay. Well, it won't, and I think we all know it. Since this summer, I've met with dozens and dozens of pressure groups, health professionals, trade unions and local authorities. All of them, when asked directly, have said that the social care system is in crisis. Yesterday, 30 stakeholders were invited to a roundtable session by the Herald newspaper to discuss these and other issues. Not one person at that event mentioned this bill or believed it would make the changes needed, and all said the system was in crisis. So let me explain why I agree with their analysis. At present, councils are taking the brunt of government cuts, and this has a direct impact on the frontline services they provide, none more so than social care. Contracts awarded a few years ago at, say, £14 an hour are now being won at £12 as contractors try to secure work in the face of council cuts that have been passed on for the Scottish Government. That may sound like a good thing, but the consequence of this is that the day after they win the contract, their staff are told that they now have to work 2 more hours a week for the same money, and they're now on the 5th or 6th year of a pay freeze. This results in a high turnover of staff, as people leave to get a better job, better paid job, maybe in a supermarket, while those left behind are demoralised and de-skilled, as often training is cut back to save money. Many are on the minimum wage, some have to pay for their own uniforms, use their own mobile phones, and do not get paid for travelling between clients. Those people are often working for less than the minimum wage. And the result of this is, as one care worker told me, that people are now only working in care because they can't find another job, and many only stay long enough until they can find another job. Presiding Officer, we simply cannot continue like this. And how we treat staff has a direct impact on the quality of care provided to our elderly, our disabled and our most vulnerable people. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to reflect on this? In these circumstances, the circumstances that I described, what quality of service does he expect to be delivered? Does he really believe the words of today's White Paper that says Scotland has world-leading social care? If he does, then I think he is the only person in Scotland who believes that. Many providers at the moment operate in 15-minute time slots. Now, when these were introduced, it was supposed to be that if a person needed an hour of care, then they got 4 15-minute time slots. That would have been provided for them. But now it seems that one 15-minute slot has become the norm, irrespective of the care required. And only today, in the Times, Age Scotland highlight that care visits are now down to 7 minutes. A world-class social care service? I think not. What level or quality of care can be provided under such a system? I repeat, we cannot continue like this. A few weeks ago at my surgery, I spoke to a young woman, 18 years old, who had just left school. She wanted to work in the care sector. She got a job with a private provider. She was given 4 days training in an office. She then shadowed a fellow worker for 1.5 days and then was sent out to her own client list. On day 1, she was given 30 visits to do. On her first visit, she was verbally abused by a client who suffered from a mental health disorder. She was quite scared. The second client she visited was a male in her 70s who had a catheter in, and she hadn't a clue what to do. And so it went on throughout her whole day. Certainly.
Ms Scanlon.
I thank the member for the points that he's raised, and I think we've all heard similar issues. But I can't help thinking that the Care Inspectorate is responsible for the standards of care. They are also responsible for inspecting care at home standards. Do you think that they're doing enough? Because there's nothing in the bill that would actually change what they're doing. Are they doing what they were set out to do?
Neil Findlay.
I think you hit on a very good point. I think care at home is very difficult to assess. It's easier in a care home. You turn up at the care home and you assess it. Care at home is much more difficult to assess. Therefore, the provider I'm talking about got a clean bill of health from the Inspectorate. And yet this is the experience of someone who was working with them. That experience went on throughout that young woman's day. A day that lasted from 7:30 a.m. in the morning till 10 p.m. at night. But of course, she was only paid for the 8 hours of pay that she was supposed to work. And what was the princely sum that she was paid? £5.03 an hour. Is this the value that we place on the care of our elderly? This is a scandal, Minister, and no matter how deep or how deeply you put your head in the sand, it will not be wished away. This bill is very limited and woefully inadequate in addressing the care crisis, not the care crisis that's coming, the care crisis that is here now, certainly.
Bob Doris.
Started talking about the bill before us. Do you see any opportunities in the bill, such as disaggregating the acute budget for older people, investing some of that in social care? Surely that's an opportunity. I understand some of the issues you raised, Mr Findlay, but you surely should be engaging with opportunities to improve services rather than just lamenting the lower practices out there.
Speakers would use their microphones.
I think we should all be addressing these issues, because these are the fundamentals of the problems with the care system as we have them. Let's not pretend that they're not there. And The bill is inadequate in addressing the care crisis that is here. We will support it, but we need a much bigger national debate about how we, as a society, value our elderly and most vulnerable people. And we need to look at the support for those who provide unpaid care, those who simply act as good friends and neighbours. We need cultural as well as legislative integration of health and social care, looking at pharmacies, GPs, families and communities. And we need to state clearly if we're prepared to invest to create a service based on dignity, care and respect, or one based on a race to the bottom, because one thing is certain, as it stands at the moment, we cannot allow it to continue. Presiding Officer, at stage 2, issues of governance, staffing, shared services, budgets, service user involvement, scrutiny and powers of ministers will be debated and amended, I'm sure. And the bill needs to be improved, and we will contribute to that process. But this bill should have been about addressing some of the issues that I have raised. It should have been about putting people at the centre, with a rights-based agenda focused on high-quality care and a skilled, motivated workforce.
Last minute.
But it's about none of this. Councils are heroically trying to deliver services under unsustainable pressures, and I salute them for their efforts. But a failure to address the real issues is, in my view, a dereliction of the Cabinet Secretary's duty and of this Parliament's.
Many thanks. I now call on Nanette Milne. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, I'd like to begin by thanking the Cabinet Secretary for giving us the Government's response to the Stage 1 report last Friday in good time for today's debate. I'm disappointed, however, that we're holding the Stage 1 debate on this particular day, because this legislation will be hugely important in the delivery of health and social care to a large and growing number of people in Scotland, and sadly it has been totally eclipsed by the launch of the referendum white paper. I'm also disappointed that the title of the bill doesn't include the main purpose of the proposed legislation, which is to integrate adult health and social care so as to improve the well-being of recipients of that care. The title focuses instead on the public bodies which organise the care, which I think is the wrong way round. I know there were compelling reasons for this, but I don't think it sends out the right message to patients, service users, their families or their carers. But these issues aside, I am happy with the general purport of the bill, and the Conservative Group will be supporting its general principles at decision time this evening. There have been many initiatives in recent years intent on achieving greater integration of health and social care, and excellent results have been achieved in some parts of Scotland. But concerns remain that joint working between partners to bridge the gap between primary and secondary health care and between health and social care hasn't been as effective as it could be and is at best patchy across the country. Because the integration agenda has not been compulsory, and barriers still exist in terms of structures, professional territories, governance and financial management, the Scottish Government has, I think rightly, concluded that legislation is required if the balance of care is to be pushed from institutional care to community provision of services with resources following people's needs. The legislation as proposed should set the framework for change, but it will only be successful if cultures and attitudes change as well, and that will depend on strong leadership at local level, committed to improving outcomes for individual people, and to true integration, capable not only of delivering these outcomes, but of doing so with the more efficient use of resources that are available. As we know, the legislation will require each health board and local authority to develop an integration plan, setting out proposals for establishing an integration authority, which may be set up as either a body corporate model with a joint board and its own chief officer, or a lead agency model where local authority and health board partners may delegate agreed functions to each other with a joint monitoring committee from these bodies and accountable to both, set up to scrutinise the effectiveness of the integrated arrangements. Concerns were raised with the committee about governance arrangements, particularly in the body corporate model, and I hope the ongoing work between the Scottish Government and its partners in the NHS and local government will lead to greater clarity around this important issue. I was fortunate enough to visit both Highland and West Lothian to hear their experiences of working as an integrated adult health and social care service under the different models. And whilst both would accept there's still much work to be done on the road to full integration, what was really striking was the enthusiasm of the staff in both areas and their commitment to person-centred care by developing a service with a clear focus on securing the best possible outcomes for people. Whilst my party, as you know, is generally not in favour of a centralising agenda, I do think the bill's provision that councils and health boards will be jointly accountable for the local delivery of national outcomes set by ministers after consultation does, as Carers Scotland said in evidence, have the potential to achieve consistently across Scotland in the delivery of holistic health and social care services. And it should help to reinforce the message that health, well-being and care are not the sole responsibilities of any single agency. The potential to extend integration beyond adult health and social care was raised as an issue, with COSLA wanting it restricted and others arguing that it was essential to include housing services, for instance, in the proposed integration arrangements. I look forward to seeing the Government's promised amendments at stage 2, but I do welcome its clarification that the bill should permit local flexibility beyond adult health and social care. Clearly, Presiding Officer, in a 6-minute speech, I can't cover all aspects of the bill, so I will just note the significant concerns that human rights, quality standards and the need to involve rather than just consult patients, users and carers are not expressed within the bill. And I have no doubt there will be some interesting discussions on these matters when amendments are submitted at stage 2. The lack of involvement of non-statutory partners like the third sector, with the statutory local authority and NHS partners at the strategic planning stage, is another controversial issue which was raised with the committee. And there are other concerns, such as the potential for cost creep mentioned by Duncan McNeill, the need to be able to share information electronically between partners, and the reallocation of budgets between acute and primary care. All important issues which need further discussion. But I'd like to focus in my final moments on locality planning and GP involvement, both essential if services are to be redesigned in a way that engages individuals and local communities in delivering the best possible outcomes for patients and other service users. I saw at first hand the success of LHCCs, which were localised to a few general practices, and I saw the failure of CHPs, which are far too big and toothless as health board subcommittees. Now we have the opportunity to truly engage again with GPs, who are pivotal in the delivery of care in the community. And I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's statement that GPs will be embedded in the process as key stakeholders in shaping the redesign of services. I do appreciate that current discussions on the issue of GP engagement in the planning and development of integrated health and social care arrangements are confidential within contract negotiations, but I am pleased they're happening, and I do look forward to, hopefully, a positive outcome in due course. Presiding Officer, I've had time just to scratch the surface of this proposed legislation, but I'm happy to support the general principles of the bill, whilst accepting there will be a number of amendments coming forward as it progresses through the next stages of the parliamentary process.
Many thanks. And we now move to open debate. And I call on Bob Doris to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I note a very thoughtful speech by Nanette Millen. I thought did the job of scrutiny very well at stage 1 here. Can I associate myself with the words of Duncan McNeill and the thanks he also gave to everyone involved in the scrutiny of this bill and who gave evidence, and indeed the Government and their civil service team. We did a lot of positive work in relation to this. Can I begin by making clear that this is a bill that I wished Parliament did not need to pass? Health and social care integration has been an aspiration for many years, but a reality far too rarely. Therefore, this bill will set up an overarching framework to deliver integration and, as a last resort, compel health boards and local authorities to get on with the job of integration where they don't do so. I will go on and talk about the structure of this bill shortly, but a bit more about what it hopes to achieve before we look at the structure, I think. We've heard a great deal already about the demographic challenges that Scotland will face with an ageing population. The challenge is to have a unified health and social care strategy for our older population that suits the needs of older people and ensures that it puts the person before the pound sign. And that is, in other words, that cost shunting between health boards and local authorities becomes a thing of the past. That means a single budget for the health and social care of older people. Too long there has been a suspicion that there is a tension between speedy discharge and delayed discharge from our hospitals. The longer a patient is in hospital, the greater the cost to the NHS, and the earlier an older person is returned into the community, the greater the cost to local authorities. Where is the patient at the centre of all this? rather than the pound sign. And currently, I don't think that's necessarily given a high enough priority. So a single budget, people before pounds, and a truly integrated health and social care system can end that cost shunting once and for all. We need to get a disaggregation of acute budgets, and I'm delighted the Scottish Government shared with us some estimates of what proportion of that acute budget may be disaggregated and put towards combined health and social care, but still no real projections in what section of local authority budgets will be put towards that. Will it just be whatever budget lines they identify from their own social care budgets, or do we have to be a bit more sophisticated about that? And I know we're not going as far as housing at the moment, but an argument could be made that in terms of housing adaptations and housing policy, there's a direct link to getting older people in an ageing population back into their house safely, happily and content, and I have to say sometimes cheaper than having them in hospital or residential homes. So we have to think a bit more sophisticated about joint budgets with health and storage and integration, and more clarity about the expectation on local authorities. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about saving money, but actually getting older people out of hospital sooner, stopping them from going into hospital in the first place, quite frankly, having them living at home happily for longer is not just cheaper, but it's better for their own outcomes also. So we have to look at what the outcomes of this bill seeks to deliver rather than just the structure of it. But we do have to, of course, look at the structure of it here this afternoon. Yes, of course.
My constant theme about care at home. Would the member also recognise, when we're looking at the quality of care, that it would be much more helpful to ensure that all home carers are given the training and the support that they need, and register with the Scottish Social Services Council much earlier than 2019?
Bob Doris, 1 minute.
Well, I have to say 2019 was a target jointly agreed by this Parliament, and it makes us world leaders in the registration of care at home employees. But it is a vexed issue, and the Government's already said if that could be accelerated in a safe and structured way, there's no reason why we couldn't do that. Now, in only 30 seconds left, there was so much more, Presiding Officer, that I wanted to say. But can I just say, when we look at structures, yes, local authorities, and yes, health boards, if it ever has to come down to a vote between health boards and local authorities, then I think we've lost the case for positive and constructive health and social care integration. But whether they have voting rights or not, we have to make sure involved in the drawing up of strategic plans are the third and independent sectors, allied health professionals, GPs and the like. So assurances that there will be proper and suitable engagement with any strategic board in relation to that. And finally, the exciting part for me could be localised strategic planning, where we don't just tell local communities, older people, what the priorities are for their care in their local area, but they also get to decide. So some more information on how that would work would also be welcome.
Please. Many thanks. Now Colin Malcolm Chisholm, to be followed by Eileen MacLeod.
I was lucky enough to be on the Health Committee on it temporarily, and therefore was able to read much of the written evidence, as well as hear all the oral evidence. And I was particularly struck by the first session of oral evidence when we heard from Professor Alison Pett, who is probably the leading Scottish academic on community care. And she said the bill per se will not make any of what is proposed happen. Legislation is not really what drives day-to-day delivery. And she was not the only person giving evidence who said that the key issues were culture change, leadership, bringing teams together on the ground, and so on. She then went on to say, and I quote for a second time from her, the most important aspect of the bill is that it states the integration principles. And she, and again several other witnesses, said they would like to see that section of the bill strengthened. So I hope that is something we will look at stage 2. And I think many members will have received a very interesting paper from the RCN and others yesterday about this. And I think this is a very important aspect of the bill. And I was particularly struck in the RCN submission by their wish to have 2 principles, among many others, one of which was protecting and enhancing the safety and welfare of service users, which I thought was pretty crucial, and also enabling service users to participate in decisions regarding their need for services and the provision of those services to them. So I think that's important as well, and of course connects up with the recent debate we had on person-centred care. So my conclusion from the evidence from Alison Page and others is that we need this bill or some amended version of it, but it is a necessary but certainly not sufficient condition for the delivery of more integrated care. Now, having said that, we have to make sure, of course, that the bill helps, is clear and doesn't get in the way. Clarity, I think, is an issue, because at several points in the committee's report we're saying we want more information about this. And one particular aspect I want to mention is the surprise I felt when we received a very, very late piece of evidence from the government, after all the evidence sessions, including their own evidence session, about the extent of health board budgets that were to be delegated to the Integration Authority. I'll read it very quickly. We anticipate that approximately half of the total health board budgets will be included within the scope of the integrated strategic plan. This would represent approximately 75% of total expenditure on unplanned bed days for age 75+. Now, that is a crucial piece of evidence that we really ought to have been able to interrogate. Well, I've been thinking about it since receiving it. How would it work in practice? Because those unplanned bed days in my area basically means the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh and the Western General Hospital, obviously St John's for Neil Findlay's constituents in many cases. So what that really sounds like is that the Integration Authority is going to have money which presumably it then has to pay the acute sector in a kind of commissioning relationship. Now, that seems to me to be going back to the bureaucracy of the internal market that we got away from. Now, I may be overstating that, but that's what it sounds like. And so it does seem to me one of the dangers of this bill is that we increase horizontal integration but reduce and damage vertical integration. So that certainly needs to be explored at stage 2 and further on. And of course the other issue is we can reduce the income to the Royal Infirmary and the Western General Hospital, but that doesn't mean their costs are reduced. So that is a practical problem as well. So some of this needs to be thought through, particularly for the large health boards such as Lothian and Glasgow. The uncertainties connected to other uncertainties about the relationship of the integration body to the parent bodies. And again, Peter Gabatas of the City of Edinburgh Council and the Health Board has already got a joint appointment. In fact, gave very powerful evidence to the committee about that. So we need to look in detail at stage 2 at the wording of the bill in that aspect. For example, section 21 says the Chief Officer, I quote, is in all respects as if the person who delegated the function, which gives the impression that the Chief Officer is a fairly autonomous person. So all that wording needs to be looked at, and if the government intends something else, they or we will have to amend the bill at stage 2. Now, finally, the locality arrangements and clinical involvement are crucial. CHPs were meant to be local, often turned out to be otherwise, to my disappointment. They were meant to be the place where primary and secondary care clinicians engage with each other. Again, that often didn't happen. So the role of GPs is crucial to these new bodies, but also, of course, service users and the third sector. So I'd like to see a bit more on the face of the bill about all of that, and I'd also like to see it included in negotiations on the GP contract. 10 seconds left. Finally, let's look at good practice wherever it is to be found. I'm sorry to the Cabinet Secretary. Second debate in a row, I'm referring him to a good example in England, but taking care Improving Care for Mrs Smith is an excellent publication from the King's Fund about Holdits as to how it's really worked successfully in Torby in Devon, realising the objectives we want of less emergency admissions and more care in the community.
Many thanks. Now call on Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Ken McIntosh. Up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm delighted to be speaking in this afternoon's debate on the general principles of a bill which will introduce a substantial and wide-ranging reform of the way in which we deliver adult health and social care. Now, the Cabinet Secretary reminded us in his opening speech why this legislation is so necessary. And as a nation, we have larger numbers of people living for longer than ever before. And of course, that is good news, but it also means that we need to re-examine how we deliver and manage care in Scotland for our older people. So the integration of health and social care services is needed, therefore, to improve outcomes for individuals, particularly for our adults with multiple long-term conditions and complex support needs, and to improve the experiences both of those who use these services and those who provide them. So, of course, key to delivering this vision, as we know, is the principle of person-centred healthcare, whereby services are integrated around the needs of the individual. Now, one of the areas that I wanted to highlight, Presiding Officer, concerns the representations the committee received on the need to ensure that the contribution of the housing sector to improved health and social care outcomes is recognised in the bill, and that the new integration authorities involve their strategic housing partners in joint commissioning to achieve person-centred quality care at home. Of course, ultimately, our aim should be that everyone, no matter the complexity of their requirements, has an equal chance of a good life. And to achieve that aim, we know that a home that is responsive to a patient's needs, particularly if they have dementia or a learning difficulty or autism, makes a significant difference to how care and support is delivered and the outcomes that it has. One of the other key issues that was raised with the committee has been around the full involvement of the third sector at both the strategic partnership and local level, as well as issues surrounding the involvement of a range of other key stakeholders, including our allied health professionals, service users, carers, disabled people and their representative organisations, all of whom have a wealth of collective experience, expertise and professionalism. Now, these are huge assets in helping to achieve that person-centred and needs-led approach to the delivery of locally based quality health and social care services. And another key voice is, of course, that of our GPs, and the evidence that was submitted to the committee by the BMA and the Royal College of GPs was helpful in allowing us to examine possible barriers to fully and successfully engaging GPs in the planning of local services. And an excellent example of integration that is already working and being driven by GPs is the Kirkcudbright Community Hospital and its adjoining GP practice, which has developed strong working relationships with local social services staff. Now, while this is only one example, the other end of the spectrum, the Deep End group of GPs case in favour of GP surgeries in our most deprived areas, functioning as natural hubs for integrated care to tackle deep-seated health inequalities, requires us to recognise that in many of those communities, services may be the least integrated. Now, that great variation in local experience reinforces the case for this bill, but it also highlights how important integration at the locality level is going to be, how important the widest involvement of our key stakeholders, including GPs and our local professionals and partners at that level, will be too, and also how important it is to scale up the capacity of the third sector, that ensuring that those working closest to individuals and communities can participate and engage fully in service design and service delivery in future. So fully involving our GPs, the third sector, local professionals, carers groups and disabled people at the locality level will make a positive difference to the delivery of integration, and localities will be where many of the key decisions concerning service users will be made. Now, already in Dumfries and Galloway, the local authority and the NHS board are clear that the way to implement integration is to focus on building up the service model at locality level first. Our region has a natural advantage since it has 4 well-established areas corresponding to the old district councils, a natural pre-existing delivery model. So the NHS and the Council have capitalised on this by commencing integration from the point closest to the service user through planning local integration in the 4 areas, rather than starting at the furthest away point with a top-level governance model. Of course, Presiding Officer, both structures need to be right, but in considering the top-level arrangements, we must not lose sight of the fundamental importance of integration in the localities, where the services will actually be delivered and the real difference made. So in closing, Presiding Officer, I fully support the general principles of this bill, and I look forward to considering the amendments during stage 2 and hope that we can actually work together to produce an act which will be regarded as a fundamental reform of the way in which we care for Scotland's people.
Many thanks. I now call Ken McIntosh to be followed by Gil Patterson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I believe that all members in the Chamber today will offer broad support for the general principles behind this bill, and I certainly want to express my enthusiasm for its direction of travel towards greater integrated health and social care. However, as others have also indicated, I have to admit to feeling slightly worried about the ability of this bill to deliver on that agenda, and to feeling downright anxious about whether some aspects of the legislation will work at all. I do, however, recognise and I want to acknowledge the good intentions behind the Public Bodies Joint Working Bill. In fact, Presiding Officer, some of the language in the proposals looked rather familiar to me from previous parliaments. I remember very clearly speaking about what was then called the Joint Futures Agenda, not long after being elected, in 1999. And for those who may not remember it, the Joint Futures Group was set up by the very first Scottish Executive more than 14 years ago now, with the specific aim of trying to improve joint working between social and healthcare and to try to secure better outcomes for patients and service users. The various recommendations of the group read like the policy memorandum for the bill before us this afternoon. They focused on joint working, the rebalancing of care between community care and acute care. They looked at how to improve the financial and management frameworks of the different agencies involved, how to establish best practice, and examined some of the difficulties around charging. Here we are, Presiding Officer, more than 10 years on and still wrestling with precisely the same thorny issues. And the reason I mention joint futures is not to sound jaundiced or cynical or to suggest that integrated working cannot be achieved, but quite the reverse. If this was important in 1999, then it is even more important in 2013, with the rapid pace of demographic change, with ever-increasing pressures on our budgets, and with the need to move to a preventative care agenda. And I mention the work that has gone on before simply to highlight what a difficult agenda this is to achieve. As members of the Health Committee have revealed in their report, legislation is itself perhaps of lesser importance than achieving cultural change. Getting health professionals, social workers, the voluntary sector and the myriad of people involved in care to work in partnership rather than within their own professional disciplines, within their own funding structures or within special areas of interest. There are practical difficulties with the bill too. I was drawn almost immediately to the issue of governance. Having just read the Auditor-General's report on police reform, there can be no one here who is unaware of how legislative confusion over roles and responsibilities can hamper the creation of a new organisation. It is strikingly obvious that if there is not clarity about the relationship between the new joint boards being proposed in this legislation and their parent bodies, the relevant NHS board or local authority, then that is a recipe for conflict. And as for budgets, I'm sure all of us will be familiar from casework, if not from our own experience, that services tend to follow the money. The difficulty here is that there are so many competing budgetary agendas. There's an expectation that the bill will save money, or at least to deliver efficiencies to meet rising demand. Alongside meeting rising demand, there's a clear drive to focus on community and social care rather than on acute care. But there's a rather less specific commitment to reallocate those acute budgets. Now, in theory, yes, reducing unplanned admissions will free up resources. But we also know that in practice, the demand in our hospitals is such that these resources will immediately become reallocated. Any bed that becomes free is immediately filled by other patients. And of course, that's before we even get into the fact that social work within the health service, within local authorities, NHS boards or housing or the voluntary sector, there will be competing budgetary needs, not simply collaborative or consensual agreement on spending priorities. There is no shortage, I'm afraid, of people or of organisations who think they can spend someone else's budget better. And of course, most important of all, it's vital that this bill succeeds, not because of organisational simplicity or budgetary accountability, but simply to make life better for patients. There's a particularly informative section in the committee's report about the difficulty in integrating the free healthcare that is available within the NHS and the social care that is subject to charges and various eligibility criteria. We know from ongoing legal cases over NHS continuing care what a minefield this can be and how much anxiety it produces. Those with chronic long-term disabling conditions or progressive neurological conditions such as Parkinson's are particularly anxious about where we will head in this area. And before this bill has even cleared stage 1, we know that people the length and breadth of the country are struggling with 15-minute care visits. Our health and care services are under huge pressure and sometimes buckling under that pressure to maintain quality and standards. But as the RCN and others have made clear, quality and safety of care are unfortunately not at the heart of the bill, or not yet at the heart of the bill. There was an excellent line in the submission from Macmillan Cancer Relief which said, in conclusion, "We believe that this debate must focus on how services will work for the cancer patient, or the patient in general, not on how it will work for the service provider." I entirely agree with that. It's a well-intentioned bill. I hope it can be delivered.
Thank you very much. I call Gil Patterson to be followed by Jim Hume.
Presiding Officer, I'm pleased to be speaking in this debate as a member of the Health and Sports Committee. With Scotland's people living longer and healthier, and all the evidence gathered bringing about the realisation that it is better for people across all ages in general to recover and be treated in their own home where appropriate, then it's imperative that all the relevant agencies are involved in the good work of ensuring that the recovery process works to a high degree and to maintain a high standard of social and health care for the individual, and that these agencies are not so much connected, but indeed intertwined to effect the best results. Although we can point to some very good examples of integration working and working well, for the best part, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the norm has been failure in past attempts. Again, from the evidence presented to the committee, we have yet to find a single authoritative voice that suggested that the integration between these sectors would be a bad thing. On the contrary, the opposite is the case, with all saying that joint working would be to everybody's benefit, both provider and receiver. It's therefore hard to think that since this is a universal goal and a goal that has a high score value at the end, legislation needs to be introduced to bring about this goal. Most of those who have questions on the lack of success have put it down to leadership. For my part, I must confess a little scepticism to that viewpoint. From the outside looking in, to me, it looks very much more about budget protection within each of the sectors than anything else. But if I'm wrong, and the commentators who voiced the lack of good leadership as the main reason, then legislation clearly does not provide or manufacture such leadership. Having said that, I'm confident that legislation is a stimulus that will make the difference, and I'm also more than confident that those working across the professions, be it health, social and indeed the third sector, have the leadership that is apparent day in and day out and are more than capable to see this become successful. During any debates in this chamber, it has been acknowledged that the well-being of the patient is paramount and that they and their families are the first and most crucial aspect, from being admitted to hospital with an illness to being released to fully recover at home. The patient needs are our top priority. And we know that most people desire to stay in their own home, albeit with vital care support and assistance, when they have conditions or are infirm. Another crucial aspect is that we can provide an integrated service that gets it right first time for the individual, and that recovery takes place with fewer relapses. Recognising that relapses are a very costly event, both in terms of money and the impact on someone's already fragile health, which may add to the cost of care. Then getting it right will allow for savings that are to be deployed back into the health and social care services to make the joint sectors even more beneficial, and so the progress goes on moving forward at all times. Of course, I must offer some caution to temper my optimism. With the UK Government's cuts agenda continuing to have an acute impact on Scotland's finances, we might be expected to do the same or even more with less money available. However, again, I hope that I am wrong in this regard and that all the hard work being carried out by all sides will be rewarded and recognised by reinvesting any savings back into the sector to ensure that our people are kept healthy. Scotland has an ageing population, and the challenges faced in the future will be huge and complex. But I hope that this legislation goes some way to ensuring that we are ready to face these challenges and rise to meet them. Presiding Officer, I am more than pleased to commend the bill to Parliament and support its progression from stage one.
Many thanks. I now call Jim Hume to be followed by Richard Lyle.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. This bill has been a long time in the making. The integration of health and social care is overdue, and an idea whose time has certainly come. Indeed, it was a key component of the Scottish Liberal Democrat manifesto at the last election, and we have long called for the delivery of common sense by having health boards, local authorities and the third sector working more closely together to provide more joined-up care and better outcomes, of course, for patients. The pressures and challenges being faced by the NHS have undoubtedly made these proposals necessary. For example, the incidence of emergency admissions has increased significantly in just the last few years, with the largest increase coming in the over 75 age group. While I am supportive of the integration of health and social care and support this bill in principle, I do of course share some reservations of many in the public and the third sectors, which I will touch upon shortly, and will be expecting further engagement from the Government on enhancing this bill as it progresses. One of my concerns, and it's well articulated by the Glasgow City Council and others in their evidence to committee, is regarding disconnects in care provision. The failure in patient outcomes today is not just because health and social care isn't integrated, but also because of a disconnect between acute and primary care. Despite this being noted in the bill's policy memorandum, some believe that these proposals will only address one of the disconnects and leave the other unchecked. The submission from Glasgow City Council highlighted integration works best when GPs and other stakeholders are engaged effectively. And the Cabinet Secretary is right to say in his response to the committee's report that structural change will not merely lead to greater partnership working, but that a cultural change is required as well. I do welcome his commitment that GP engagement will form part of the contract discussions, but he will have to provide more detail on the Government's plans, irrespective of ongoing negotiations. However, the Scottish Government must be realistic. The demands on GPs may be about to increase significantly at a time when the proportion of the NHS budget given to general practice has fallen. Regardless of integration joint boards agreeing integrated budgets, the Cabinet Secretary must still explain how he plans to put a square peg in a round hole, as the capacity and resources simply might not be there at a time when the desire is. I note the understandable concerns also of COSLA regarding the certain degree of latitude the bill in its current guise would appear to offer the Cabinet Secretary by widening the scope beyond adult social care to bring any local government function within the parameters of this legislation. I will give the Cabinet Secretary the benefit of the doubt and characterise this as an unintended erosion of local democracy and creep towards centralisation. And to his credit, he appears to have realised there is a real issue with the bill as it has been drafted, and I welcomed his commitment to the Health and Sports Committee that he would work alongside COSLA on amendments at stage 2 to rectify this. That said, the air of centralised power can't be overlooked. The electorate look to their health boards to provide their health services and elect their local councillors to manage their social care services. They are the ones who the electorate will rightly hold accountable. And yet the integration plan designed by the two bodies cannot simply be agreed between them. It must be signed off by Scottish ministers. The Cabinet Secretary will be well aware that many have described the plans as too prescriptive and too detailed, and I suppose they do have a point. In addition to integration plans having to be signed off, the joint integration boards have been instructed by the Scottish Government who their joint accountable officer will report to. Not only that, but the Government will also tell them what the responsibilities will be. So can we not at least entrust the integration joint boards to be best placed to determine what is most appropriate for them locally? So it would be interesting to see if the Cabinet Secretary agrees or not that perhaps it isn't entirely necessary to personally determine the job criteria and the line managers of newly created positions. I'll leave that for him to reflect upon, and perhaps Minister will reflect upon that in his summing up. This is not a perfect bill, far from it. There are still issues to be ironed out regarding democratic accountability, the extent of the third sector's role and many others. But the principle is sound, and that's why we as Liberal Democrats will be supporting it at stage 1.
Many thanks. I call Richard Lyle to be followed by Hansala Malik.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Health and Sports Committee, I am also pleased to speak in this debate today, as the committee has spent some time working on the Public Bodies Joint Working Bill. With a total of 81 submissions received from a call of evidence and various sources giving oral evidence during committee meetings, Further to this, the committee visited projects in Inverness and West Lothian to gain first-hand experience of the joint working on the front line. I was on that occasion able to be at the visit to West Lothian, and I was very impressed with the way that West Lothian were carrying out this bill and taking this bill on board and what they were doing locally, implementing changes which should improve their service for local users, and I hope that others will do the same and follow their example. It is welcome news that the population of Scotland is living longer, healthier lives. The life expectancy for Scotland has increased, and it is expected to grow by 2/3 in the next 20 years. I'm sure many of us are very happy about that. Because of this, we need to change how our care is delivered, now rather than waiting for this to become a problem further down the line. I am therefore happy with the proposals which this government have in this bill. I am pleased to note that the Health Cabinet Secretary has welcomed the support of the committee regarding the principles of integrated health and social care with the aim of improving outcome for service users, and I know he is committed to doing that. The committee notes that there is a need for the legislation to provide change and provide outcomes for people using health and social care services, as under the current system not enough progress has been made. At this moment, Scotland has experienced problems that integration could help to address. These include unscheduled emergency admissions to acute care, delayed discharges from acute care to community setting, delays in accessing required support to a lack of communication between services. There are too many occasions where the hospital and local social work are not on message with each other. And as has been identified earlier, I, as a former councillor, had to intervene in a number of occasions within my own area in North Lanarkshire to resolve the fact that patients were not, who were ready to come out of hospital, but there were problems at the home as the support had not been supplied. And on that occasion, on various occasions, I had to contact both social work and the hospital in order to ensure that the patient's needs were being met. If these problems can be solved, it would be good news for all patients, but especially those in the last months of their lives. The delays in these patients getting discharged often results in them becoming too sick to move back to their homes where they wish to be and to the communities where they would rather be. Under the new bill, health boards and local authorities will be required to create an integrated plan for the local authority area. There are, as has been said already, two models available. Firstly, the body corporate model, in which the health board and the local authorities would delegate functions to a joint board headed by a chief officer. And secondly, the lead agency model, where local authorities and health boards can delegate functions to each other under the oversight of a joint monitoring committee. By allowing each area to choose which of these two options best suit them, that will ensure that those in the communities and their relevant committees will receive the best care tailored to their needs. And I would suggest that there is a case that all partners, plus GPs, plus local authorities, must work together and make local arrangements. And as the point was made earlier, we did have representation from many organisations. But the problem, as I said at the time, with all the number of organisations, how many people are you going to get round a table, and is the table going to be big enough? The bill will allow ministers to set out national health outcomes for which health boards and local authorities will then be held accountable to both Scottish ministers and members of the public to deliver these targets. Local councils and health boards should see that this bill is meant to solve and resolve the problems which are not presently being dealt with under the present arrangements. Although it has been said that this legislation itself does not guarantee a successful outcome, I fully support the intentions of this bill and its aims to provide better outcomes for patients and service users, whilst delivering better value to meet the challenges of the ageing population. And I agree with this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Hansala Malik to be followed by Roderick Campbell.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and good afternoon to you. I welcome the opportunity to speak about Public Bodies Joint Working Bill. I think we can all agree that aims of the bill is to create a system of high-quality care that is seamless and effective. In my many years as a local councillor in the Labour Party in Glasgow City Council, and now as a member of the Scottish Parliament, constituents regularly come to me as they have slipped through the cracks in the current system, cracks caused by lack of joined-up thinking and practice between social care providers and health boards up and down the country. This must come to an end. This must stop. However, I feel the current bill does not go far enough to provide integrate health and social care. Many departments in councils up and down Scotland have merged and renamed themselves as health and care, but apart from rebranding, little has been done to integrate the very difficult cultural and decision-making structures. Therefore, I have known a person who came to me for support as the medical health team who cared for his care was closed by a doctor who stated that he had personalized disorder and was untreatable. Yes, untreatable. Completely ignoring the possibility that social workers within his team could offer him. A complete lack of joint-up thinking led to a vulnerable person feeling like they had been abandoned by the system. Which, of course.
Bob Doris.
I really appreciate Mr Malik giving way. I think you make some excellent points about the cultural challenges in relation to that in Glasgow, where health and care partnerships didn't work. In this bill, under section 12(1), there's the power for ministerial intervention to compel that integration. Would you agree with me that that's a power that hopefully will never have to be used because local authorities and health boards will finally get on with it and do this properly?
Hanzala Malik.
Yes, my friend makes a fine point, but I'm going on to that just to address that, and that is that ignoring the possibility that social workers within a team could have offered him, sorry, I've already mentioned that fact, the complete lack of joint-up thinking leads to vulnerable people feeling abandoned. In addition to this bill that not properly deals with the majority differences in eligibility between health and social care systems, health is a universal service that is free at the point of delivery, and social care provision is subject eligibility criteria and charging. We need to ensure that this bill sets out very clear and transparent decision-making criteria that service users and their carers are involved in further eligibility for service to be provided effectively. In terms of joint-up thinking and working, one of the things that I felt that the Glasgow City Council had a structure. They had a committee which had area regional committees which dealt with doctors, healthcare workers and others to provide that service. That was actually done away with. And I'm not sure whether this bill will actually readdress that because, quite frankly, our doctors need all the support they can get. They're working under a lot of pressure. I've gathered over the last 2 years that our doctors seem to be doing more and more in terms of service provision and provision of service. A lot of work is being done in the communities by the doctors as well, which is very welcome. However, that said, in terms of clarity of services is the most important element of this bill. And I think if there are people who are going to continuously fall through the cracks, means that somewhere we are missing the point. I think there are far too many agencies trying to grapple together to provide service to individuals. And what happens is, if one of those lets the client down, or the patient down, or the individual down, the whole structure fails. So we have to try and ensure that that doesn't actually happen. And therefore, I call upon the Cabinet Secretary to ensure that the amendment to the bill, which will secure fundamental right of service, is there, so that we actually force all the partners to work together to ensure that the service provision is in fact appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the final open debate speaker this afternoon is Roderick Campbell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this important debate and welcome the committee's Stage 1 report. At roughly £4.5 billion per annum, according to the 2010-11 figures, health and social care spending on those aged 65 and over constitutes nearly a third of the health and wellbeing portfolio budget. Investment in these areas is not only significant, but absolutely essential, therefore. It's important to ensure that we fund and design an integrated service that will be sustainable. The consensus surrounding the bill is very positive. That should come as no surprise, given that it reflects the current international trend towards the integration of health and social care. I was delighted to learn that the group overseeing Fife's adult health and social care integration, Communicating Health and Social Care Integration in Fife, which is comprised of staff from NHS Fife and Fife Council, was last week shortlisted from 130 to the final 3 in the Herald Society Awards 2013 Health and Social Care Integration category. That accolade was dedicated to the Council and NHS Fife colleagues, partners, service users and patients who have helped support the group's work and demonstrates that successful progress is already being made on the ground. Presiding Officer, it's fair to say that we need to fund healthcare and social care as efficiently as possible owing to the current pressure on public finances. But I do think we need also to work towards a care sector that offers a career option and motivated staff working towards providing a first-rate service. And we need to strive to improve the standard of care that some patients are currently receiving as we plan for the inevitable demographic changes of the future. Scotland is not alone in moving towards a joined-up approach to delivering these areas of care. Indeed, for the last 40 years, there's been a movement in this direction right around the world. There are no direct parallels with Scotland, but we can and should always learn from international examples. Nearer to home, of course, England has introduced the Health and Social Care Act 2012. Whilst the principle is the same, integration is proving, I understand, difficult to implement, according to some professionals, who cite the fragmenting effect of introducing private enterprise into the NHS as an obstacle to success. And in Wales, in 2007, a primary secondary social care strategy, chronic conditions management demonstrators, was introduced for people with certain multiple chronic illnesses, which has resulted in considerable reductions in bed days resulting from emergencies. Indeed, there are falls of 27%, 26% and 16.5% in successive years. And to see the advantages of a local approach as the bill provides for, we need look no further than Sweden. Turning to the committee report itself, I would like to touch on a couple of things. The first being the recommendation in paragraphs 43 to 45 regarding the justification for the bill. Some witnesses who gave evidence to the committee have suggested that steps could have been taken towards a more joined-up care service delivery using existing legislation and guidelines. Some also pointed out rightly, in my view, that legislation will not bring about the changes alone, will not bring about the changes we want to see. And I listened to what Malcolm Chisholm said on that point earlier, which I agree with. I've spoken before, however, about the transformational effect of legislation, that legislation being introduced can lead to attitudinal changes across the country. Not only do individuals and organisations become obliged to observe a set of guidelines, but many do so proactively and before they are required to remain ahead of the curve. I therefore believe the committee is right to describe this bill as the, quote, momentum needed to make the widely desired progress a reality. With regard to the provisions relating to the 2 possible options for the delivery of the integrated services in the bill, the body corporate model and the lead agency model, I note that the Cabinet Secretary has undertaken to provide more information on the roles and duties involved in these arrangements, and I welcome that. I also welcome the consensus amongst relevant organisations in the government on the basic model behind these proposals, that local government and health boards should be jointly accountable. That's also, I think, very positive. Presiding Officer, however, it's absolutely clear that we cannot have a system where health boards and local government are locked in budgetary disputes with one another. Such disputes serve no one in the long term, and ultimately the biggest losers are the patients themselves, who are liable to experience delays and confusing information about their care, as experience has shown. The case for cooperation has, I believe, been made very strongly, and the provisions of the bill, which allow a high degree of freedom in choosing the model best suited in any given area, will mean, I hope, that more health boards and local authorities will be able to take forward adapted plans of their own to meet national standards, but tailored means to a unified end. To conclude, Presiding Officer, I commend the committee on their thorough report, and I look forward to monitoring the progress of the bill as it passes through the Parliament. Thank you.
Many thanks. We now turn to the closing speeches, and I remind all members who participated in this debate that they should be in the chamber for the closing speeches. I call on Mary Scanlon, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would also like to commend the Health Committee for their excellent work in scrutinising this bill and bringing forward the Stage 1 report today. And I'm very pleased to be back in this debate on health, on the public bodies and joint working. And I'm actually even more pleased to speak in such a positive way. After hearing all the problems, I can honestly come to this chamber and talk about what's happening in Highland, because I think it is an undoubted success. But I appreciate that there are still challenges. Last week in the debate on children and young people, Highland Council was commended on all sides of this chamber for their work on GIRFEC, getting it right for every child. Now, I agree that this model is working in Highland, and I commend Highland Council on their plan to recruit 5 more health visitors. There was a time, not so long ago, that health visiting seemed to be withering on the vine, with some health visitors expressing the view that they did not want to become social workers. The lead agency model in Highland allows Highland Council to focus on the needs and priorities for children and young people, and not only to adopt an integrated model of delivery, but more importantly, an integrated model of care and support covering all aspects of a child's needs. There's still a way to go, and I would like to see more support, more holistic support for troubled families. But I acknowledge that the care model adopted by Highland Council is good, and tremendous progress has been made from the past, which, in my personal opinion, was a recipe for passing the buck. The lead agency for adult care, NHS Highland, has also brought significant improvements, and I accept again that there are challenges in the way ahead. But in this respect, I also acknowledge the many submissions to this bill which stated that cultural change is difficult. But in the past, when local constituents came to my surgeries to ask if I could help to get their elderly parent out of Raigmore to be cared for at home or in a care home, I then had to phone social work, and on many occasions the social work ring-fenced budget had run out, and people had to wait to the end of the financial year, which could be several months. But as far as the council was concerned, the person was being cared for, albeit at a higher price to the public purse in hospital, and this led to high figures for delayed discharge, otherwise known as bed blocking, which of course impacted on hospital admissions. Now, including twice last week, I emailed the chairman of NHS Highland, who can arrange the appropriate care package delivered at home or in a care home in a seamless manner. It's in the interest of NHS Highland to free up beds and to ensure appropriate care for every patient. In the past, Highland Council paid up to 80% more per person per week to be cared for in a council-run residential care home compared to the independent and voluntary sector. So now that NHS Highland are in charge of this budget, questions need to be asked as to why council care homes receive so much more funding, given that all care homes have to achieve the same quality standards as set out by the Care Inspectorate. I accept that this is a challenge. And finally, on the Highland lead agency model, and I was aware of this when Neil Findlay was speaking, but earlier this year, the care at home services received a very, very poor inspection report. This wasn't a disaster. It actually proved and has provided an opportunity for NHS Highland to bring in more support and more training for the care workers to allow them to provide the level and quality of care that we all expect. And it also brings the carers into the whole healthcare system, where they get the maximum of support. But having spent many years as a member of the Health Committee, in particular the scrutiny and passing of the Community Care Act 2002, I can confirm even back then, all but one witness stated there should be a single agency delivering care of the elderly. There was no such consensus when it came to who should deliver. We spoke about social work, spoke about NHS, and GPs were also mentioned. There was talk about pooled budgets, aligned budgets, but at that time, there were even more significant cultural differences between NHS and social work, which I believe have improved quite considerably in recent years. I also appreciate that there's no single definition of integrated care, but I use Highland because where good practice exists, it should not be ignored. And I do support the written submission from the MS Society, which stated there should not be too heavy a focus on structural change at the expense of the primary focus on improving outcomes for people. That is my point. The Highland model focuses on the person, not the budget, not where they are, not NHS, Highland and Council constantly arguing. So my focus is, and Highland's focus, is on the person, and I'm sure that's the focus of the committee. What's happened in Highland has not required legislation, but it is disappointing that progress has been so slow in other parts of Scotland. I welcome the legislation, and we will be supporting stage 1 of this bill.
Many thanks. And I now call on Rhoda Grant with 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think it's reasonably unanimous throughout the Chamber that we all support the general principles of the bill. We need an integrated health and social care service that has no barriers and that appears seamless to service users and their carers. However, I'm not sure that the bill alone will achieve this. It needs to go further. But I'm also not totally convinced that you can legislate for the type of leadership and cultural change that Duncan McNeill and Malcolm Chisholm talked about that is really crucial to making the step change in how we deliver care. Mary Scanlon talked about the Highland method, who have adopted the lead agency method, which nobody else appears to be going forward with. And they were very clear that the success, or the partial success, because they admit it's a work in progress and it's still got a long way to go. But the fact that this is happening at all has meant that there has been strong leadership. Leadership at both Council and NHS have been committed to this change. There has been a cultural change within the staffing structure as well. But most of all, there's been trust, and I think that's what they said, where it was very difficult to replicate the lead agency method anywhere else unless you had that trust. And I think you can't legislate for that kind of trust, or indeed cultural change. So I think while the legislation maybe looks at some of the mechanisms, the bureaucracy, we need to be very clear that this alone will not work. We need to look at the culture and leadership within different organisations and how we nurse that and help it along.
Ms Grant, would you be able to move your microphone round a wee bit? I can actually hear the private conversation in front of me somewhat better than I can hear yourself. Thank you very much.
Is that better, Presiding Officer? Thank you. The bill deals mainly with the bureaucracy, but even that, to me, doesn't seem to be done that well. We're setting up a board with an accountable officer. However, staffing and resources appear to remain within the parent bodies. And therefore, what budget will be required by the new body if they don't have a responsibility for paying staff, and indeed capital resources remain within the ownership of the parent authority? How can that new body direct their use? And that's not very clear at all. The Cabinet Secretary said in his opening remarks that integrated budgets were essential to the success of this, but in committee he said that healthcare money would remain ring-fenced, as the government have said in previous budgets, that health service funding is ring-fenced and protected, and that local government money would therefore remain part of the local government settlement. So it's very difficult to see how you can integrate those budgets if organisations have to account for that money separately and actually show that the money is being spent within their own organisations and within their existing responsibilities. So I think we really need to look at how all this is going to work. There's also the Health Board budgets that Malcolm Chisholm touched on, that half health board budgets will go in to the new body. And that might work in some instances, but the points were made that if you're talking about acute centres of excellence, which maybe take patients from all over the country, what part of their budgets are ring-fenced for that and what part can actually go to local service delivery when they also provide national services. So I think those things are not very clear at all. Neither is it very clear what thought has gone on into the impact of people working together with different conditions of service, salaries, pay banding, pensions, policies, things like disciplinary and grievance policies. How do they work when people are working together? Who takes out a grievance? What policy do they use if they're working with somebody employed by a totally different agency? So I think all that needs to be worked with, along with the governing bodies, along with the trade unions. And I think we need to make some progress on that, because, as Ken McIntosh said, you know, if the budgets, the powers and the governance aren't sorted out, we end up in lengthy wrangling, and I can see that happening if the Cabinet Secretary doesn't look at those very important issues. But let me be clear that service users and their carers need to be at the centre of this legislation, and I think they were quite concerned as to where they fitted in. How were they going to be involved? Was co-production really at the heart of the bill, or were they, again, something that services were provided for rather than people that designed their own services? And it was also a bit concerning as to how they would be represented. The point was made that the voluntary sector interfaces also represented service providers, and quite often service users felt drowned out by the voices of service providers. So we need to make the distinction between service users and service providers and make sure that the individual is very much at the centre of what we are providing, helping them live their lives and enabling them indeed to live the way we would wish to live. If they want to move, that their care package should be portable and move with them, that they should know what that would cost in other areas. So I think it's really important, and I think Ken McIntosh made the point that this was made by Macmillan Cancer Research as well, that the service user really needs to be at the centre. And putting the service user at the centre also means that we need to look at quality and safety, and I think the RCN, among many other organisations, asked that this be included in the bill, that we knew that we need minimum standards of care. People need to access the same level of care regardless of where they live and know what to expect. But you can't have quality unless you have reasonable conditions for staff, and Neil Finlay talked about the working conditions of many of the people that actually deliver this care in the front line. People not even getting the minimum wage, not getting training, not getting time to do their job, being frustrated and distressed by the stress that the job causes if they can't do it properly. So we need to make sure that quality is in the face of the bill. And indeed, some of the principles regarding integration needs to be moved up on the face of the bill and emphasised, so everyone is very clear that the culture needs to change as well as the different structures in place. There are many more issues that we need to look at. For instance, inspection. We need joint inspection. It needs to be independent, it needs to be rigorous, and it needs to be available to workers and indeed for staff as well, and for service users. And whistleblowers also need to be protected in those conditions. I've come to the end of my time, but I very much hope the government will listen and strengthen the bill, because I think it has the ability to be a good bill if those concerns are listened to and taken into consideration.
Many thanks. And I now ask Michael Matheson to wind up the debate. Minister, you have until 5 p.m.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's been a very good debate this afternoon around this Stage 1 report, with what I thought were a number of very important contributions. I think the thing that's probably struck me the most in the course of this debate is that the change that this piece of legislation will introduce to health and social care and its integration is actually one of the largest changes which will take place in the health and social care system in almost a generation. It's a very significant change that it's going to bring about, and it's unusual to have a piece of legislation that's going to result in such a significant level of change that has got such cross-party support. And I think that in itself is a reflection of the fact that, as the committee report recognises, is that there is a broad consensus around this particular issue and the need for it to be taken forward. And in his open remarks, the Cabinet Secretary set out some of the key drivers around the need to take integration forwards, for example, around the demographic challenge which we face. However, they in themselves aren't just the reason for going about integration, because I thought in Ken McIntosh's contribution he highlighted the history of some of this debate, the joint futures back in 1999, the fact that the document for taking forward joint futures echoed many of the opportunities that are created through this legislation about partnership working, joint budgets, joint commissioning of services. The only thing I would say is that it actually predates joint futures. The whole integration agenda started very much in the 80s and on into the 90s. But it's a debate and an issue that has been around for some time, and it has presented some real challenges. I've no doubt that Malcolm Chisholm, while he was a Health Minister, and tried to pursue some of this agenda in some areas where there were successes, in other areas where there weren't successes, as well, it wasn't as successful. I think all demonstrate the challenges in trying to make sure that this happens on a much more systematic and consistent basis across the country. And that's why I think this legislation is extremely important. What this legislation won't do, though, is it's not about a piece of legislation that will resolve all of the issues of difficulty that we have within our health and social care system at the present time. But what it will do is it will help to make sure that we give greater focus to how we can focus in on some of these challenges much more effectively, and to make sure that health and social work, our local authority and health boards are working much more closely in partnership. Now, I think it's worth reflecting the fact in Neil Finlay's contribution, he referred to West Lothian and the route that they have pursued since 2003, which I think is an interesting illustration, because joint futures goes back to 1999. There was a 4-year period before West Lothian Council were able to take forward this agenda, and they are the area in the country which is the most advanced in this whole matter, which is to be properly recognised. And I often say to colleagues in other parts of the country, saying, what's it going to look like? Well, go and look at what's happening in West Lothian, in the way in which they have been able to take this agenda forward, and you can see, I will do if I can just finish this point, you can see the way in which they have been able to lead this agenda forward. But what I think the experience back from the 90s, joint futures, and also what's happened in West Lothian teaches us is that if you don't provide the legislative framework in order to drive this forward, it won't happen on a consistent basis. And that's exactly what this legislation is there to do. Build on the good practice that's already taking place, the areas where there is good joint working taking place, but to make sure that it happens on a consistent basis and it happens right across the country. And I'll give way to Neil Finlay.
Neil Finlay.
Just say I welcome the Minister acknowledging the excellent work being done by that Labour Council, and I'm sure that they will be a shining example for other councils to follow. Minister.
And I know that my SNP colleagues, when they were in charge of West Lothian Council, did exactly the same in making sure they drove that agenda forward. I could, of course, look at other councils and say they're not doing so well. But I'm not going to get into that, because I think it's about making sure that we create the legislative framework in order to drive this agenda forward in a much more effective way. And Bob Doris, in his contribution, set out that this has been an aspiration for several decades now. And this piece of legislation will make it happen in a way that has never been achieved before, because in doing that, we can much more effectively integrate the services that people receive. And in Mary Scanlon's contribution around the experience in Highland, I thought was a very good illustration of the benefits that come from the greater integration of services, ending that cost shunting, that lack of planning that can go on between different agencies in taking this whole agenda forward. And the experience in Highland with the approach they have taken, I think, bodes well for the benefits that can come from integration. Some members have raised concerns about the potential for services that were previously provided by health moving into social care and then being charged for. I think what we should be careful about in considering this debate is that the whole issue of moving more services into the community is not a new one. In the late 80s and in the 90s, we had the closure of the long-stay hospital beds for people with a mental illness and also for those with learning disabilities. And most of those patients moved into the community with social care packages to support them in the community. Many of them continue to be in the community, supported in that way. So this is not something new in itself, but it's a process that's taken place previously. But the other thing I think it's worth keeping in mind here, it's not about taking something that we do in hospital, say for example, such as physiotherapy, and just to put it out and to give it the responsibility of a social care partnership and for them then to be responsible for deciding on where they charge it or not. That's not what this is about. This is about actually making sure that our joint commissioning of health and social care services are actually jointly planned, that they are being integrated, that they are working collectively together to look at what's the best way to do that. So that is about what's the best way in which we can configure social care services at a local level in order to make sure that meets the demand that's been faced by the healthcare system, and how can we better configure them in order to reduce the demand that there may be in some aspects of the healthcare system. So it's about how you configure these services and to make sure that they're planned in a much more effective way, rather than taking something that health presently does and just putting it into the social care setting. And a number of speakers, Duncan McNeill in particular, and so did Hamza Malik in his contribution, highlighted the importance of general practitioners in taking forward the integration agenda. Primary care is absolutely key to the success of greater provision of healthcare provision within the community setting, and to also make sure that social care provision is properly aligned with that. The work we are doing with the British Medical Association around issues such as the contract give us an opportunity to try and do some of these things in a way that's never been achieved before. And I'm very much of the view, and although these negotiations are confidential, I'm very much of the view that we are all singing from the same hymn sheet here. GPs want to see it happening better, social work want to see it happening better, government, independent sector, the third sector, all want to see it happening better. What we need to do is find a way in which it allows us to deliver that on the ground for patients on a day-in, day-out basis. And the work that we're taking forward with the BMA is in order to assist us in looking to achieve that. Can I say that in Neil Finley's contribution as well, he highlighted concerns around the quality of inspection process for those at home. And I recognise some of the challenges in being able to conduct inspection within a home setting in itself. And that's why the Cabinet Secretary has already commissioned the Care Inspector to take forward work on how we can better inspect that process and to make sure that it's much more rigorous around the quality of the inspection process and the quality of care that's been assessed at that time as well. Can I say, though, that inspections aren't a bad thing? Inspection is a good part of the system that can help to drive up standards and can help to create improvement. And just as Mary Scallon said, the report in Highland was not a fantastic report, but what it has done is it's created a platform in which to improve the service. And that's what we need to do on a much more systematic basis right across the country. And the work that the Cabinet Secretary has asked the Care Inspector to undertake is exactly about doing that, making sure that we have a more robust and clear inspection regime for care at home. I believe, Presiding Officer, this is a piece of legislation that not only has cross-party support in this Parliament, I think it has public support, because people want to see services working in coordination and in planning their services much more effectively within their communities. And this legislation will help us to make significant changes around how we can deliver that in our communities right across Scotland. And I would call on those to support the Cabinet Secretary's motion this evening.
That concludes the debate on the Public Bodies Joint Work in Scotland Bill. We now move to decision time, and there is one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion number 8389, in the name of Alex Neil, on the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.